Alan Bradley never considered himself an ideal husband, but he knew for sure that he did not deserve what was done to him. 38 years old, tall, athletic, with barely noticeable gray hair at the temples, he looked better than most of his peers. In his youth, he was an ordinary middle-class guy who grew up in the suburbs of Chicago. His father is a strict but fair person. He worked as an engineer at a factory. His mother taught mathematics at school. They did not bathe in luxury, but they did not need anything either. Alan has always been smart and hardworking. He chose a career in real estate, working his way through real estate agencies until he opened his own company selling luxury homes. Now he ran a small but profitable business and could afford a comfortable life. A nice house in a quiet area, 2 cars, regular family trips. He thought he had done everything right. He loved his job, despite his busy schedule, and always made time for his family, especially his daughters, who meant everything to him. He met Amy 15 years ago when they were in their early 20s. She was beautiful, energetic, with a charming smile that made him forget about everything. They got married quickly, not so much because of dizzying love, but because of an unexpected pregnancy. Amy gave birth to their first daughter, Lily, now 14, 7 months after their wedding, followed 3 years later by their youngest, Sophie, now 11. In the first years of marriage, everything seemed stable, even happy. Alan worked a lot, and Amy took care of the children until they went to school. Then she decided to build a career and soon took a high position in a large marketing company. This meant frequent business trips, late calls, and a growing distance between the spouses. Over time, he began to notice changes. Amy began to devote less time to her family. She was irritated by conversations about children, and she increasingly returned late, smelling of expensive perfume and a glass of wine. On weekends, she preferred to work or meet with colleagues rather than spend time at home. She increasingly retreated into herself, and even in rare moments when they were alone, there was an invisible wall between them. He felt that he was losing his wife, but he pushed away these thoughts. He believed that everything would work out. But when one day he found correspondence with Dan on her phone, his world collapsed. He didn't want to believe his eyes. Every message, every emoticon, and every tender word felt like a knife in his back. He didn't make a scandal or throw her things out of the house. Instead, he began collecting evidence. He realized that if he wanted to emerge victorious, he must be cold-blooded and calculating. Dan Harper was her boss, a charismatic, domineering man who seemed accustomed to getting whatever he wanted. Alan knew very well who he was dealing with and knew that such people easily lose interest when they get what they want. He began to observe, study, and analyze the situation in order to strike at the most unexpected moment. He decided that revenge would be sweet, and he will take revenge in a way she can't even imagine. Alan and Amy met during their senior year of college. He studied at the Faculty of Business, she studied marketing. Their meeting happened by chance. During a party with mutual friends, Amy accidentally spilled a glass of wine on him, and they both laughed, starting a conversation. It was a lightness that Alan had not felt in his life for a long time. He immediately noted her bright, infectious laughter and graceful movements, and his confidence and calmness. They talked until late at night, sharing dreams, plans, and life stories. After that evening, they began to spend more and more time together. Alan found Amy a source of inspiration. Her energy made him see the world in a new way. She was a dreamer, but also goal-oriented. Unlike his previous relationships, he felt like he could be himself without fear of judgment. Amy, in turn, admired his practicality and dedication. She said that she felt safe next to him. Their romance developed rapidly. They went on dates, traveled to small towns, opened new restaurants and cafes. Alan gave Amy books, and she introduced him to classic films. However, a few months into their relationship, they learned that Amy was pregnant. This changed everything. The decision to get married was not so much a conscious step as a necessity. Alan understood that he had to take responsibility, and Amy, although she was scared, agreed. They played a modest wedding, which was attended by only their closest friends and relatives. There was no magnificent ceremony, no honeymoon in the mountains, only the feeling of a new stage, full of the unknown. Despite the forced marriage, their intimate life was rich and passionate. Alan and Amy have always felt incredibly attracted to each other. Their first night after their wedding was just the beginning of many unforgettable moments. They found time for each other even during busy periods of life. The evenings ended with long caresses in which they drowned, forgetting about everyday worries. They experimented, looked for new facets of pleasure, and discovered each other again and again. Their intimacy was not only physical, but also emotional. They read each other's desires without words. The wedding was modest, but sincere. Only the closest friends and relatives came. They rented a small hall, decorated it with candles and flowers, and after the ceremony they went on a little honeymoon in the mountains. There, among the endless landscapes, they talked about the future, made plans, and were confident that they could overcome any difficulties together. Life after marriage seemed wonderful. They rented a small apartment in Chicago, both started careers, but always found time for each other. In the evenings, they cooked dinner together, had movie nights at home, and on weekends they explored the city, trying new cuisine or visiting museums. These were years of true harmony, when every day brought joy. Their bed nights were as exciting as the first days of dating. They did not lose the spark, enjoying each other until the morning. Shortly after their wedding, Amy gave birth to their first daughter, Lily. It was a difficult but happy period when they were just starting to build their life together. It was unexpected, but they received the news with joy. Alan felt ready for fatherhood, and Amy promised that they could combine work and raising a child. They looked forward to Lily's appearance, bought children's things, and furnished her room. The birth of their daughter was the beginning of a new stage for them, full of worries, sleepless nights, but also boundless happiness. 3 years later, Sophie was born, and family chores became an integral part of their daily routine. Alan worked even harder to provide for his family, and Amy became increasingly focused on motherhood. Their lives had changed, but they tried to find moments for the two of them. They still had candlelit dinners and went out into nature, but more and more often the conversations turned to children, work, and everyday issues. However, their passion did not disappear anywhere they found opportunities to be alone, tearing each other's clothes off, as in the early years. Thus began their path to the inevitable turning point, but then they did not suspect that their world would soon change forever. Since those unforgettable first years of marriage, when every day was filled with laughter and endless passion, Amy and Alan's relationship gradually began to change colors. Then their life was like a light waltz, in which they searched for the rhythms of happiness together, spending evenings talking, dreaming about the future, and anxiously awaiting new adventures. They went on long forays out of town, rode bicycles along the winding paths, had picnics on the lawns, where the sun played on their hair, and time seemed to stand still in the tender embrace of nature. In those days, every moment seemed priceless, and little things seemed like droplets of joy that added up to the fabric of their common life. However, over time, when life made its own adjustments, a slow, almost imperceptible process of alienation began. Amy gradually plunged into the whirlpool of work, and at the same time their family comfort began to give way to gray everyday life, in which the house ceased to be a haven for the soul. Alan, observing the changes, at first tried to find an explanation in the accidents of fate, hoping that the storm would pass and the sun of their old relationship would rise again on the horizon. One evening, when Amy was again late in the office, Alan could not hide his anxiety. "Are you working late again?" he asked, trying to keep his voice calm, but a hint of concern flashed in his eyes. Amy, hurrying home, just smiled tiredly and touched his cheek, as if saying goodbye to her remaining strength. "Yes, the project is on fire," she said quietly, promising that everything would get better next week. But the weeks turned into months, and Amy's promises remained just empty words. The house was filled with silence, which had previously been filled with loud conversations and warm laughter. Instead of cozy dinners by candlelight, the table was now set with monotonous food ordered at home, and the phone became more important for Amy than face-to-face communication. It seems that she became a stranger in her own home, as if her soul was locked behind a glass wall, through which Alan saw only distant shadows of his former love. One day, sitting together on the sofa, He again dared to ask a question full of care and anxiety. "Amy, are you okay?" he asked, trying to catch at least a grain of her real self, which he once knew so well. "Yes, I'm just tired," she answered, plunging into thought, as if she was searching in her memory for a long-forgotten recipe for inner peace. "There's so much work that I don't even have time to breathe out." Her words seemed to be just an excuse, an attempt to hide the true state of her soul, where feelings were drowned under the weight of responsibilities and endless stress. Alan suggested taking a short vacation to once again immerse himself in an atmosphere of mutual understanding and warmth, a trip where they could forget about all the problems and again get a taste of life together. "Now is not an option at all," she answered firmly, shaking her head, as if fighting off the reluctance to listen and change the usual course of events. "The company has so much stuff, I can't afford it." This evening, sitting at the table where the whole family used to gather, Alan felt the distance growing between them. The quiet clink of dishes and the silence that filled the room spoke about many things, about lost intimacy, about how dreams dissolve piece by piece when routine takes over. Memories of old nights when they, forgetting about everything, talked for hours in bed, enjoyed life, and shared their deepest dreams, became painfully sweet for Alan. Now their bedroom had turned into a cold place where the silence screamed of lost feelings. He often turned over, trying to find at least a piece of the warmth that once warmed them both. But the gaze that met with emptiness only reminded him of how much their lives had changed. One day, deciding to bring back at least a little of the old romance, Alan prepared dinner, carefully reminiscent of those times when every meal was a real feast for the soul. He lit candles and turned on soft music, as if trying to turn back time. But the appearance of Amy, tired and indifferent to every effort, only confirmed his fear. All attempts to revive the past were met with cold refusal. "Alan, you know that I'm tired," she said quietly, barely noticing the set table. "I just want to eat and go to bed." Her words, like an icy scent, shattered all hopes of restoring lost intimacy. She quickly retreated to the bathroom, leaving him sitting among the cold dishes, feeling his heart clench with loneliness and misunderstanding. The next morning, at breakfast, Alan tried to find at least a grain of warmth in her gaze, but instead he met only evasiveness and coldness. "I'm going on a business trip for a few days," Amy said dryly, without meeting his eyes. Her words sounded like a sentence, another justification, another time when work became more important than family. Alan was perplexed. Could work really absorb the spark that once lit their hearts? He tried to remember the last time they simply enjoyed each other's company, without thinking about deadlines and responsibilities, when every word and look was filled with love and mutual understanding. Every day, the feeling that their marriage was coming apart at the seams became more acute. The thin line between professional duties and personal relationships was blurred beyond recognition, and along with it, tenderness and passion, which once seemed eternal, faded away. Alan understood that it was time to change something, otherwise in the near future they both could be captured by feelings alien to them, forever losing that sincere closeness that once made their lives bright and rich. This is how their life continued, between words and understatement, between worries and an elusive dream of the old days, when happiness was an inseparable part of their existence. Alan quietly hoped that a glimmer of warmth would return to their home, and that Amy might someday realize that the true richness of life lies not in success at work, but in the ability to share every moment with her loved one. Warm evening, cold distance. The evening turned out to be warm, and Alan decided that it would be nice to spend it with his family. He ordered pizza, grabbed a soda from the refrigerator for the girls, and a bottle of wine for himself and Amy. Lately, evenings like this were becoming rare, and he hoped that this would help bring some coziness back into their home. He wanted to see the smile on his wife's face, hear her laughter, and feel that they were still one family. Friday nights were once their tradition. The children were happy about pizza, movies were chosen vying with each other, and Amy always joked that Lily had too serious a taste and Sophie was too childish. They argued, laughed, but eventually found a compromise. Now something has changed. Alan felt this more and more every week. Dad, can I have a double portion of cheese? Sophie asked cheerfully as he heaped slices of pizza onto plates. Of course, baby. You are our main cheese lover. Alan grinned and handed her the plate. Lily, their eldest daughter, raised her head from the phone and looked at her sister skeptically. Sophie, aren't you afraid that you'll become a cheese queen? This sounds cool. The younger girl giggled, taking a huge bite of pizza. Yes, the main thing is, don't forget about the vegetables, Alan interjected, pouring soda for his daughters. He stole a glance at Amy. She sat opposite, smiling weakly, but observed more than participated in the conversation. Once upon a time, she was the soul of such dinners. She told funny stories, made fun of the girls, and always knew how to keep the conversation going. Now her gaze was distracted, her movements were slow, as if she were not here. Alan suppressed a sigh. He didn't want to think about bad things, but more and more often he caught himself having disturbing thoughts. "How was your day, girls?" he asked, trying to make the atmosphere warm. "School was boring," Lily complained, picking up a piece of pizza with a fork. "Again, we were forced to write an essay about what we want to become in the future." "Well, how much is possible? And who do you want to become?" The father smiled. Lily rolled her eyes, but answered anyway. "Don't know. Maybe a designer, maybe something with marketing. Or even move to Europe and become a writer." "The main thing is to do what brings you joy," Alan said, looking at Amy out of the corner of his eye. She seemed not to hear their conversation, thoughtfully picking at the pizza with a fork. "Mom, what do you think?" Lily asked, breaking her out of her thoughts. Amy blinked as if she had just returned to reality. "About what?" "Well, you work in marketing yourself. Maybe you can give me some advice." "Oh, yes." Of course, it was as if by an effort of will she brought herself back into the conversation. "This is a good field if you like working with people and coming up with something new." But her voice was somehow distant, as if she was pronouncing these words automatically. Alan felt anxiety stir within him. "Have you been thinking a lot today? Did something happen?" he asked, trying to keep his voice soft. Amy didn't answer right away. "No, I'm just tired. Tomorrow is an important meeting. We need to prepare," she said quickly, taking a sip of wine. "But today is Friday. Maybe you can leave work until tomorrow," he suggested carefully. "Alan, I said I was tired." Her voice sounded harsher than she might have intended. He pursed his lips. The girls looked at each other, and Sophie, as if trying to diffuse the atmosphere, cheerfully asked, "Can I watch a movie after dinner? Anything funny?" "Good idea." Lily supported her. "Let's choose something together." "Great, I'll bring the popcorn," Alan said, hoping that this would help restore the atmosphere of warmth. I, I guess I'll go and work," Amy suddenly said, getting up from the table. "You watch without me." Alan watched silently as she headed into the office, her silhouette disappearing into the corridor. A second later, there was a quiet click of the door closing. He felt something inside him shrink. "Dad," Sophie called quietly. He turned to his daughter and forced himself to smile. "So, who's ready for the movie?" But even as they sat on the couch, wrapped in blankets, laughing at stupid jokes on the screen, the feeling of comfort never returned. Alan looked thoughtfully towards the closed office door. Something was wrong, and he didn't know if he was ready to find out the truth. Lily couldn't fall asleep for a long time. She lay in her room, staring at the ceiling, and thought about what had been happening in their family lately. Mom has changed. She didn't laugh anymore, didn't tease Dad, wasn't as interested in their affairs as before. She also always looked tired and distracted, as if she was somewhere far away. Sometimes Lily noticed how her mother looked thoughtfully at the phone, nervously tapped her nails on the table, sighed as if trying to get rid of some thoughts. Lily rolled over onto her side, pulled her knees to her chest, and closed her eyes. But sleep did not come. It was alarming inside, as if something invisible, but very important, was happening right in front of her nose, and she could not understand it. Finally, deciding that she couldn't just fall asleep, Lily got out of bed and walked barefoot to the kitchen for a glass of water. The silence in the house seemed thick and sticky, like a dark blanket covering everything around. As she walked past the office, her attention was drawn to the dim light and the slightly open door. She slowed down and cautiously looked inside. Mom was sitting at her desk, leaning over her laptop. The light from the screen cast a soft bluish glow on her face, emphasizing the shadows under her eyes. There was an unfinished glass of wine on the table next to her, and she was clutching a pen in her hand, tapping it on the edge of the notebook. Lily felt her heart clench. "Mom," she called quietly. Amy flinched, as if she had been caught by surprise, and quickly raised her head. "Lily, are you still awake?" "I can't," the girl shrugged. "Can I come in?" Mom nodded and put down her pen, trying to smile. But her smile was weak, strained. Lily walked into the room and carefully sat down in the chair opposite. "Mom, are you okay?" Amy blinked and looked away, as if she was trying to hide something. "Of course, dear, just a little tired." "But you were always tired," Lily remarked. "But before, you still laughed and talked to us. And now, you're different." Mom nervously ran her hand through her hair, clasping her fingers at the back of her head. "It's just that the work is difficult now, that's all," she answered, but there was uncertainty in her voice. Lily looked at her carefully. She knew Mom too well. It wasn't just because of work. "Mom," she said carefully, "are you angry with Dad?" Amy turned her head sharply to her daughter, but almost immediately lowered her eyes. "Why do you think so?" "Because you hardly talk to him. And if you do say it, it's as if you don't want to." Amy sighed and rubbed her forehead tiredly. "It's just, sometimes adults get confused. There are times in life when you don't know what to do next. Are you sure it's just about work?" Mom fell silent again. Her fingers began to tap nervously on the table. "Mom, you can trust me," Lily said softly, trying to catch her gaze. Amy laughed quietly, but the laugh was sad, almost lifeless. "Sometimes, honey, some things are difficult to explain even to yourself, let alone to someone else." Lily felt something tighten in her chest. "But can you talk to Dad? He will always help, right?" A bitter smile flashed across my mother's face. "Dad won't understand some things." These words sent a chill through Lily. She silently extended her hand and squeezed her mother's palm. Amy flinched, but did not remove her hand. She just looked at her daughter for a few seconds, and then she squeezed her fingers a little tighter. "I just want you to be happy, Mom," Lily said quietly. Mom looked at her with sad tenderness. "Thank you, honey. I want that too." But Lily knew that her mother was not speaking completely sincerely. There was something hidden in her eyes, something that she could not or did not want to talk about. Lily felt something was changing, something important, and something she might have to learn, even if she's not ready. Alan sat in the living room, staring at the TV screen, but hardly paying attention to what was happening. My thoughts returned to Amy again and again. Her coldness, constant delays at work, detachment. All this worried him, but he tried not to get hung up on it. For now. Suddenly, he heard light footsteps on the stairs. Turning around, he saw Lily standing in the doorway, hesitantly fingering the hem of her t-shirt. There was anxiety in her eyes. "Are you awake?" he asked softly. "I can't," the girl shrugged. "Can I talk to you?" "Of course, honey." "Did something happen?" Lily came closer, sat down next to her on the sofa, and was silent for a while, as if trying to find words. Her fingers nervously twisted the hem of her t-shirt, as if she didn't know where to start. "It's about Mom," she finally said. Alan tensed, but tried to remain calm. "What's wrong with Mom?" She's strange. It's like I'm always somewhere not here." Lily twirled the pillow in her hands. "Today I spoke to her, and I had the feeling that she was not telling me the whole truth. I asked her what happened, and she simply said that she was tired. But I see that this is not the case. She's avoiding me, avoiding us." Alan nodded, listening carefully. He himself noticed the same thing. "Do you think she's upset about something?" he asked carefully. "I think she's hiding something," Lily answered honestly. "She's not the same as before. Even when we're at dinner, it's like she's looking right through us. Dad, I'm scared." Alan ran his hand over his face, hiding his irritation. He understood that this was not just a teenage fantasy. Lily was a smart girl, and if she felt something, then there really was something wrong. He felt helpless because until the end he hoped that these thoughts were just a figment of his imagination. Moms can be tired, he said carefully. Her job is not easy. Maybe she just needs time to calm down a little. Lily bit her lip as if unsure whether to continue. Dad, you feel it too, right? She finally asked, looking him straight in the eyes. Alan held his breath. He could have lied. Say that everything is okay. That mom just needs a rest. But at that moment he realized his daughter is no longer a child, and she deserves honesty. Yes, he said quietly, I notice it too. Lily lowered her head, as if this answer did not surprise her, but still upset her. Will you talk to her? She asked. Alan ran his hand through his hair and sighed heavily. I'll talk. But for now, let's not jump to conclusions. Fine. Lily nodded slowly. Okay, but Dad, promise that if something is wrong, you won't ignore it. Alan squeezed her hand and smiled faintly. I promise. But inside he already knew. The conversation with Amy was approaching, and he must be prepared for what he hears. Lily sat next to him for a little longer, then stood up, but before leaving, she looked at her father with sadness. Dad, I just want us all to be happy, like before. Alan looked at her and then turned off the TV. Now he had no doubt he had to get to the bottom of the truth, even if it turned out to be painful. He got up, went to the window, and looked out onto the street. The dim light of the lanterns flooded the empty street. Drops of rain lazily flowed down the glass. The night was painfully quiet. Alan's gaze slid to Amy's car parked outside the house. He remembered noticing inconsistencies in her schedule a few days ago. There seemed to be delays at work, but from time to time he noticed that her car was parked in a parking lot far outside their area. He didn't think much of it, until tonight. Alan turned around, glancing again at the stairs leading up. He knew that Lily was still awake. Her words echoed in his head. Maybe he should check Amy's phone? This thought was unpleasant, but he could no longer brush aside the disturbing premonition. With Lily, he firmly decided that it was time to find out the truth. He stood up and walked slowly towards the bedroom, his heart beating a little faster than usual. He felt that he was on the threshold of something important. There was silence in the bedroom. Amy's phone was on the bedside table. Alan took a step forward, then another. He slowly extended his hand, his fingers almost touching the device. The door suddenly creaked quietly. Alan shuddered and abruptly pulled his hand away, as if he had been caught in the act of a crime. He turned and saw Amy's door in the opening. Her gaze was tired but wary. Are you still awake? Amy asked, slightly surprised. Alan immediately withdrew his hand, trying to remain calm. I was waiting for you, he answered calmly. I wanted to talk. Amy threw her jacket onto a chair, rubbed her temples, and sat down on the edge of the bed. About what? Alan looked at her carefully, and there was wariness in his gaze. What's happening to you, Amy? He asked. You haven't been yourself lately. Constant delays, fatigue, you move away from us. Amy sighed and ran a tired hand over her face. Just work, Alan. I'm exhausted. You know how much has happened lately. Projects, meetings, pressure. Sometimes I just need a little time to myself. Alan nodded, but felt that the answer was too simple, too convenient. Are you sure that's the only thing? He asked softly but insistently. Amy looked at him, then suddenly smiled. Yes, she said, coming closer and placing her hands on his shoulders. I know I haven't been the best wife lately. I feel guilty for going to work so often, but I missed you. She leaned over and kissed him. There was something new in her lips, a mixture of fatigue, longing, and desire. Alan tensed for a moment, but then kissed him back, trying not to think about his suspicions. Perhaps he's making things up. Maybe it's really all about fatigue. Amy moved closer. Her breathing became faster. Her hands ran along his back. Alan felt her smoothly leading him towards the bed. You know, she whispered in his ear, lightly biting his earlobe, I've been thinking about this all day. Is it true? he muttered, letting her take the lead. She smiled and pushed him onto the bed, sliding her hands under his shirt, slowly undoing the buttons. Her touch was greedy, but there was something desperate about it, as if she was trying to assert control over the situation. "I need you, Alan," she whispered, running her lips along his neck. He no longer thought about oddities, about doubts. Now there was only this moment, her warmth, her smell, her desire. Their bodies merged in a dance filled with the forgotten fire of passion. When it was over, Amy lay next to her, her breathing deep and even. She closed her eyes, but her hand was still on his chest. "Let's have a family day tomorrow," she suddenly suggested. "It's just the four of us, no work, no thoughts about problems." Alan looked at her, trying to understand what was hidden behind her words. She looked sincere, but something inside him whispered that this was not the end. "Yes," he nodded, kissing her forehead. "Let's." But the doubts that settled in his soul did not disappear. The morning started surprisingly calm. Alan woke up before anyone else, stretched out, and looked at Amy, who was still sleeping, clinging to his shoulder. He tried to convince himself that everything was fine, that maybe he really was pushing himself too hard. But somewhere in the depths of my soul, doubts still sat like a thorn. He carefully climbed out of bed, threw on a robe, and went down to the kitchen. As he poured himself some coffee, he looked out the window at the serene morning, thinking about the day ahead. Maybe this family day will really help restore harmony, or is this just a temporary respite before the next storm? An hour later, the whole family gathered in the kitchen. Amy smiled, which was happening less and less, and looked cheerful, but Alan noticed her intense look when she thought no one was looking. "Well, what are we going to do today?" she asked cheerfully, sipping her coffee. Lily and Sophie immediately started talking, vying with each other. "To the park. There's a festival there today," Lily suggested. "And then to the cinema," Sophie picked up. "Maybe we can have lunch at that cafe by the lake," Lily added. Alan looked at Amy, trying to catch something in her expression, but she just nodded. "Great idea. A park, a movie, and in the evening you can cook dinner together. How do you like it?" The children enthusiastically agreed. To Alan it seemed too perfect. It was as if she was deliberately trying to create a feeling of harmony, but he decided not to spoil the day with doubts. The park was noisy and crowded. Children's laughter, music, and the ringing voices of presenters announcing competitions were heard everywhere. The festive atmosphere enveloped them as soon as they entered. The first thing Lily did was pull them towards a brightly decorated carousel. The girls laughed as the horses rose and fell, the wind blowing their hair, and Alan watched Amy. She looked relaxed, carefree, almost the same as before. "Shall we go to the Ferris wheels?" Amy suggested as they exited the carousel. Upstairs in the cabin, there was a stunning view of the park and city. Alan put his arm around Amy's shoulders, and she, leaning against him, quietly exhaled. "It's so calm here." He felt her fingers tighten on his arm. A moment of intimacy, real or illusion. Having gone downstairs, they went to the playground. The girls took part in funny competitions, throwing rings on bottles and knocking down cans with balls. Lily won a teddy bear and immediately named him Barney. But Alan noticed that from time to time Amy was distracted by looking at her phone, and her smile sometimes looked forced. Once he noticed how she hastily put the phone in her pocket when he came closer. After the park, they went to the cinema. Lily chose a family comedy and the children laughed, but Alan could barely follow the film. Amy sat next to him, and when she took his hand, he felt two feelings fighting inside him, joy and anxiety. He squeezed her fingers, trying to understand what was hidden behind this gesture. Her attempt to become close again, or a mask. After the cinema, everyone went to a cafe by the lake. The day was approaching evening. The water shimmered in the light of the setting sun. "Let's get something special," Amy suggested, flipping through the menu. They ordered truffle pizza, a cheese plate, and a bottle of white wine. Alan and Amy drank wine, chatted about past trips, how Lily was afraid of butterflies as a child, and Sophie once hid in the closet for 2 hours playing hide and seek. The children played by the water, and Alan and Amy looked at each other, as they had done long ago. For a moment, he wanted to believe that things were really getting better. Returning home, they all cooked dinner together. Lily was chopping vegetables, Sophie was stirring the sauce, and Amy and Alan stood at the stove, preparing pasta. Lily, "Stop carrying tomatoes," Amy said, laughing, hitting her daughter on the nose with a spoon. "And Sophie has already eaten half the cheese," Alan teased. The kitchen was filled with the smells of fresh herbs, cheese, and garlic. At some point, Amy leaned towards him and whispered, "Thank you for this day. I needed him." Alan nodded but said nothing. He knew this day was wonderful, but was he sincere? While he was clearing away the dishes, his gaze fell again on Amy's phone lying on the table. He knew the truth was out there. The question was whether he was ready to hear her. Alan woke up abruptly in the middle of the night, as if he had been awakened by an inaudible call. The body was tense, the chest was compressed by an unclear but heavy foreboding. He lay motionless, feeling the echoing silence of the bedroom, broken only by Amy's measured breathing. She slept peacefully, her back turned to him, her long blonde hair falling softly onto the pillow. He looked at her, and a dull, caustic anger slowly flared up in his chest. Everything looked perfect: a cozy evening, a home-cooked dinner, her gentle smile, a light kiss before bed. And yet this did not dispel his doubts. On the contrary, the feeling of lies that permeated the last months of their marriage only intensified. He knew. I just knew. Intuition screamed, and the inner voice persistently whispered, "She's lying. She's betraying you." Amy's phone lay on the nightstand, just a few centimeters from his hand. He glanced at the small, harmless device, and then back at his wife. Two desires fought inside, to trust her or to find out the truth, whatever it may be. "It's not too late," something responded inside. "You can just put your hand back, close your eyes, and fall asleep again, leaving doubts behind." But he already knew the answer. Slowly, almost silently, he reached out and took the phone. A slight movement of the finger, and the screen lit up with a soft bluish light. Alan's heart began to beat faster. Several notifications, missed calls, and one message. His eyes narrowed as he read the text. "Sweetie, you were great yesterday. Thinking about you. Looking forward to seeing you again." In an instant, the world shrank to a single point. Alan's fingers clenched tighter, and the blood began to pound in his temples. He clicked on the message, opening the chat. The sender's name made him grit his teeth. Dan Harper. Her boss. Goat. Bitch. It was as if a dull fire had exploded inside, burning everything around. Scrolling through the dialogue, Alan felt his fingers go numb from tension. It was all there, damn open and dirty. The photos she sent to that bastard. Confessions, words that she no longer spoke to her husband. She called Dan my. She wrote how misses it. I love to have sex with him in the office. How lies to her husband about delays at work. Hell, they even discussed, when can we find another meeting? He wanted to stop, but he continued reading. Every word, every emoticon, every detail burned him from the inside. "Baby, I can still taste you on my lips. You were so hot. I'm going crazy without you. God, I think about you even in bed with my husband." Alan felt everything turn inside him. A woman of easy virtue, a traitor. He whispered through clenched teeth. His hand clenched the phone until his knuckles turned white. I wanted to throw him into the wall. I wanted to wake her up, scream in her face, rip her out of bed so that she could see what it was like to stand in front of a ruined life. But no. Take a deep breath, long exhale. She doesn't even suspect that he knows. And this is his advantage. He forced himself to put the phone back in its place, carefully, as if nothing had happened. He closed his eyes. My heart was pounding so that it seemed to be audible in the silence of the night. Dream? No, there will be no sleep. Now he had a plan. Now he had everything to destroy her. "You, bitch, are going to lose everything," he thought, looking at the ceiling. But even with this feeling, he knew. Peace for him now was just a ghostly dream. Amy wasn't always like this. She had really loved Alan once. She remembered those days when she couldn't wait for him to return from work, when his every touch made her heart beat faster. They were young, in love, ready to move mountains. But the years passed. Life gradually turned into a series of repeating days. Children, bills, work, everyday life. The passion faded away, replaced by habit. Their conversations became shorter and shorter. Kisses became a formality, and sex became a rare event, an almost mechanical act that was more reminiscent of fulfilling a marital duty than an expression of love. Then Dan Harper came along. He was the complete opposite of Alan. Charismatic, self-confident, with that look that turned everything inside. He knew how to gain attention, how to make a woman feel special. In the first days of working at the company, he paid almost no attention to her, but then something changed. The glances began to linger a little longer, the smiles became a little warmer, and the conversations became deeper than ordinary work discussions. "You look amazing today, Amy," he said one day, walking past her office. She grinned, not paying attention. But a few days later, he complimented her again and again. "Do you know that you are the only person in this office with whom I am really interested in working?" he said one evening when they stayed late. She felt something tremble inside. There was more than just professional interest in his voice. It was seductive, but not rough, not intrusive, but subtle, tightening, like a cobweb from which you didn't want to break out. She resisted. Oh yes, in the first months, she convinced herself that it was just flirting, nothing serious. After all, she had a family, husband, children. But every time Dan passed by, touching her hand a little longer than necessary, when their gazes crossed in meetings, a fire flared up inside her that Alan had not lit for many years. And then everything happened. Late evening. Almost empty office. Amy was left finishing the report when Dan walked into her office, casually leaned against the door and said, "You work too much. Maybe it's time to take a break." She smiled, but before she could answer, he was already nearby. His hand touched her shoulder, a slight movement, but it was enough. She didn't pull away. Her heart was beating wildly, her breathing became heavier. Everything inside demanded resistance, but when his lips covered hers, when he squeezed her waist and pressed her to him, she could not say no. From that moment on, everything changed. They began meeting in hotels, in his apartment, even in the office after work. Adrenaline, excitement, the forbidden fruit that she greedily bit into again and again. Amy knew what she was doing was wrong, but damn it, she couldn't stop. Dan gave her what Alan had not given for a long time, a feeling of passion, desire, attention. Next to him, she again felt young, desired, alive. This night became for Amy not just another fleeting escape from reality, but a true immersion in a whirlpool of passion and forbidden pleasure. In the dark room, where only the faint light of the moon penetrated through the thin curtains, Dan turned into the embodiment of hot desire. His gaze, full of promises and unbridled passion, riveted her, making her forget about everything except the moment here and now. When their lips met in a long, burning kiss, it seemed as if time had stopped. Dan, with every touch, left invisible marks on her skin, as if painting pictures of passion and desire on her. His hands, confident and firm, searched for every curve of her body, igniting a flame in her that had been extinguished for so long by the routine of everyday life. His every movement was filled not only with physical attraction, but also with the promise of new, unknown sensations that only he could bestow. At this moment, the office and household chores gave way to a storm of emotions and unbridled attraction. Dan wasn't just a colleague, he was a greedy boredom eater, hot and indomitable, who knew how to awaken a side of her that she had long forgotten. His touch was bold and gentle at the same time, as if he was reading her thoughts and feelings, making her heart beat faster and her breathing quicken. Passion was read in every kiss, in every glance, an invitation to leave everything behind and plunge into a whirlwind of forbidden pleasures. Silky sheets became the arena for their secret meetings, where passion was expressed in the daily ritual of awakening feelings. Dan, with his confident presence and unbridled energy, was a master of his craft. He knew how to push Amy to the limit, how to make her forget everything except the moment when every touch, every breath became a sign of new life. In his arms, she felt all the fatigue and sadness disappear, and youth, full of fire and desire, arose again in her soul. And the further their secret relationship continued, the brighter the realization became that Dan was something more to her than just forbidden fruit. He was the embodiment of the passion she dreamed of in those days when love was pure and fiery. In every glance they met, in every wild night, she found solace and freedom from boredom, from routine, from what had once been home. Now home was where the hotel lights were burning, where gentle moans of pleasure sounded, where Dan, this incredibly hot and alluring man, gave her a life full of sensuality and true passion. She began to stay late at work more and more often. Alan believed what she said about urgent projects, busy schedules, late-night negotiations. He didn't ask questions. He believed her. And she continued to lie. One day Dan, lying next to her in bed after another crazy night, lazily ran his finger along her thigh and asked, "Have you ever thought about what it would be like to leave him?" Amy froze. The thought that had crossed her mind from time to time was now spoken out loud. "Are you serious?" she whispered. "I'm not saying right now," he grinned. "But imagine, you could be with me, always, without having to go home and pretend everything is fine." She didn't answer, but that night, lying in bed next to Alan, she realized for the first time. Her family had not been to her home for a long time. The real her stayed there, in the hotel room, in Dan's bed. And the more time passed, the more she wanted to return there. Alan woke up early, although he had only slept for a couple of hours. My head was buzzing, but not from fatigue, but from the rage that was boiling inside. He lay staring at the ceiling, feeling his old life slowly but surely turn into ruins. Last night put everything in its place. Now he knew the truth. No guesswork, no doubt, only the naked, vile, disgusting truth. Amy was breathing calmly nearby. She didn't even suspect that he knew everything. Her body was relaxed, her face was peaceful. Did she sleep the same way after every night with Dan? Did she return home with a smile, kiss him, knowing that just a couple of hours earlier she had moaned under another man? How easily she played the role of a caring wife and mother, pretended to be tired when he wanted intimacy, and then went into the shower to wash off traces of someone else's body. Alan clenched his fists. He felt anger spreading through his body, squeezing his muscles, causing a dull ache in his jaw. But he didn't let her take over. Previously, he might have jumped up, lost his temper, and demanded an explanation. Maybe he would even throw a tantrum. But not now. Now he was cold. This woman was not worth his emotions. Now she is just an object to be destroyed. Alan turned his head and looked at her again. So calm, as if nothing had happened. As if she hadn't betrayed him, hadn't wiped her feet on him. He glanced over her face, over her lips that whispered dirty words to another man, over her arms that hugged him after touching someone else's body. "You don't even know what I know, bitch," flashed through his head. He slowly sat down on the edge of the bed, trying not to wake her. Take a deep breath. Exhalation. He must control himself. If he wants to win, he must be cool. He left the bedroom and headed to the bathroom. He turned on the tap and splashed his face with cold water, trying to come to his senses a little. He looked in the mirror and saw a new person. Previously, he was a husband who doubted, was afraid of making a mistake, hoping that it was just his paranoia. But now this man is dead. He is no longer a husband. He is a hunter. He left the bathroom and headed to the kitchen. He brewed strong coffee and sat down at the table, placing his hands on the surface, feeling the coldness of the glass under his palms. A plan was already forming in my head. He knew he needed time. We need to prepare everything. You can't go wrong now. He remembered her phone number. This damn screen on which he saw messages from Dan, his dirty words, her responses. "I love you. I miss you. I want you." Damn slutty woman. She smiled at him, said that she was tired, and then at night she wrote to another man how she wanted him right now. She laughed at him. Previously, he would have thought that he was not good enough, that he had done something wrong. But now he understood that it was not his fault. She was the one who betrayed her family. She's the one who chose to be a lying bitch. Alan took a sip of coffee and tapped his fingers on the table. Playing the long game is his strategy. He won't cause a scandal. He's not going to throw her out of the house today. No, it's too simple, too primitive. He will make her suffer. He will take everything she loves from her, step by step, methodically, without haste. The first step is to collect evidence. He needs more than just screenshots of her correspondence. We need something that will destroy it completely. Maybe we should put surveillance on her phone, or maybe catch her with Dan. Also, consult with a lawyer. Prepare documents. He will take everything from her. His hand clenched into a fist. He looked at the kitchen clock, 6:45 am. In 15 minutes, Amy's alarm will ring. She would come downstairs, smile at him, kiss him on the cheek, as if nothing had happened. Like she's not a whore who spends her nights in another man's bed. Alan smiled, although there was nothing kind in this smile. Let him play his role. She doesn't even realize that her world will soon collapse. The alarm clock rang at 7 am, filling the house with a mechanical sound. Amy stretched, yawned, and slowly opened her eyes. Alan was no longer in bed. She ran her hand over the empty space next to her, frowning in surprise. He usually didn't get up before her, especially on weekends. She lay in silence for several seconds, trying to get rid of the vague feeling of anxiety. Lately, it seemed to her more and more often that something was changing in her house, but she could not understand what exactly. Shrugging her shoulders, she stood up, put on her robe, and went downstairs barefoot. The kitchen smelled of coffee and toast. Alan was sitting at the table, cup in hand, silently reading something on his phone. A frying pan with scrambled eggs was smoking on the stove, and plates for the children were already laid out nearby. Usually the morning preparations were chaotic, but now everything looked too orderly, too quiet. "Good morning," Amy said, coming closer and placing her hand on his shoulder. "Yeah," he answered briefly, without raising his eyes from the screen. She frowned, but decided not to make a big deal. Maybe you didn't get enough sleep, or was something bothering him. She was used to his usual morning grumbling, but now there was something different in his voice. Something. Aliens. She opened the refrigerator, took out orange juice, and poured herself a glass, casting quick glances at her husband. He drank coffee and scrolled through something on the screen without saying a word. Previously, he always commented on the morning news, grumbled, joked, or at least asked her plans for the day. Today, nothing. There was a clatter of feet on the stairs, and Sophie burst into the kitchen, beaming and full of energy. "Dad, can I have pancakes instead of toast?" she asked, hugging his neck. Alan, as if on cue, changed. He smiled at his daughter and patted her on the head. "It's late, princess." "There are 20 minutes left before school," he answered, smiling warmly and sincerely. Amy knew that smile all too well. And then he looked at her, and the smile disappeared. His face became blank and distant again, cold. Lily was the last one to enter the kitchen. She immediately noticed that her father was behaving strangely. He spoke to her and Sophie, but when Mother addressed him, he answered briefly, dryly, almost mechanically. The girl frowned as she watched him pull away, not even looking at Amy. "Mom, are you picking us up today?" she asked, sitting down at the table. "No, I have a meeting, but Dad will give you a ride," Amy answered, turning to Alan. "Is it true?" He took a sip of coffee, put the cup on the table, and nodded. "Yes," he said briefly, without looking at her. Lily noticed this. She looked at her mother, then at her father. Something heavy, tense, invisible, but tangible hung in the air. At breakfast, Amy tried several times to get her husband to talk, but he either did not answer or got off with monosyllabic phrases. This was starting to irritate her. They had a wonderful family day yesterday, but now he seemed distant. Something has changed. She felt it on her skin, but couldn't figure out what it was. "You've been so quiet all day today," she finally said, putting the dirty dishes in the sink. "I'm just thinking about work," he answered calmly. Amy wanted to ask something else, but at that moment Lily rose from the table and cast a long, searching look at her. "Mom," she suddenly said, "did you do something?" Amy blinked in surprise. "What?" "Well, I don't know. Dad's just weird. He talks to you like he's angry." Alan slowly looked up at his daughter and then turned his gaze to Amy. There was a shadow in his eyes. Or maybe it was something else. He grinned. "It's okay, Lily," he said calmly. "I'm just thinking. Shouldn't I just be quiet sometimes?" Lily bit her lip but remained silent. Amy felt an unpleasant ache in her chest. Something has changed. She felt it. She just didn't know how much yet. Alan sat in the car outside Amy's office, watching the entrance. He sent the girls to school, and now, instead of going to work, he decided to spend the morning usefully. Yesterday made him understand that there was no time to waste. He must collect evidence. Anything he can. He thought about her phone. Its contents are the key to everything. He has already seen her correspondence with Dan, but he needs more. More evidence, more dirt for him to use when the time comes. Ordinary screenshots are good, but he needs irrefutable facts. Photos, videos, audio recordings. If he wants to destroy Amy, he must be willing to strike in a way that she can't justify. He'll check her phone again tonight. Only now he doesn't just read messages, but will copy them. He has already found the right application that will allow him to synchronize her correspondence with his computer. She won't even know that he reads her every move. It might be worth putting a hidden voice recorder in their bedroom, or even a security camera in their car. He needs the whole picture, every detail. Suddenly, he noticed her car driving up to the building. Amy came out, quickly looked around, took out her phone, and, it seems, wrote a message to someone. At that moment, Alan's own phone vibrated. He looked at the screen. "Hello, love. Have a nice day. I'll try to come back early." Alan's face remained impassive. What a fake show. She didn't even know he was watching her. She didn't know that her mask had already started to crack. He put the phone down and continued watching. A few minutes later, Dan emerged from a black Mercedes in front of the office. Alan had seen it before, but now looked at it more closely. This bastard, he was dressed in an expensive suit, walked with a confident gait, clearly accustomed to getting everything he wanted. This man thought that he could easily fuck other people's wives and get away with it. He crossed paths with Amy Wright at the entrance. They exchanged short glances, said almost nothing to each other, but that was enough. She quickly walked inside while Dan lingered, taking out his phone. Alan frowned. He was sure Amy had texted Dan before she came in. It was all too much of a joke. Too neat. They didn't even look at each other for very long, but that was part of their dirty little theater. He looked at his watch. 8:42. A typical work morning. Everyone around was going about their business. People were going to offices. Cars were moving along the road. But for Alan, this day was the beginning of the war. He took a deep breath and pulled his phone out of his pocket. I dialed the number of my old friend, a private detective. "Bob, hi. I need your help." And the sooner the better. Now he knew for sure that he was doing everything right, and that was just the beginning. Alan sat in his car, clutching his phone in his hand. The heart beat evenly, but inside there was no longer the same anxiety. Now only cold calculation. A few seconds later, a hoarse, slightly tired voice was heard on the other end. "Bobby is listening." "This is Alan," he said briefly, looking out the windshield, behind which pedestrians were rushing by. "I need your help. Urgently." There was a pause on the other end of the line, then a heavy breath was heard. "I haven't heard anything like this from you for a long time." "What happened?" "I want to check on my wife," Alan answered sharply. "I already have reasons, but I need proof. Not guesses, but irrefutable facts." Bobby chuckled. His voice became slightly mocking. "So you want the dirty details? Photos, videos, messages. Anything you can get," Alan confirmed. "Keep track of her, her movements, who she meets, when and where. Can you punch the phone?" "I can. But do you understand that this is illegal?" "No worse than you," Alan said. "Just make sure I know the truth, and then I'll figure it out myself." Bobby paused, then laughed quietly. "You're scaring me, buddy. Are you sure you want to know this?" Alan closed his eyes and sighed heavily. I already know. I need to capture this. Okay, Bobby finally said. Give me a couple of days. I'll get to it immediately. It's urgent, Alan added. I want to know her schedule, where she goes, who she meets, what places she visits. If possible, record conversations. I need to know what exactly she's saying to that bastard. Bobby snorted. Understood. You want the full deal. Fine. I'll set up an observation. How far are you willing to go? Alan thought about it. He didn't want Bobby to do anything too drastic. He needed facts, not unnecessary problems. Don't go too far, he warned. Just surveillance. Photos, videos, calls. But I need a strict connection to places and times. We'll do it, Bobby said calmly. If she has a lover, I'll lay him out for you on a silver platter. Alan nodded, although Bobby couldn't see it. I'm waiting for the report, and the sooner the better. He hung up the call, put the phone on the seat, and looked in the rearview mirror. In the reflection, he saw himself, but it was already a different person, a man ready to go to the end. Alan did not immediately understand when exactly he began to pay attention to her. Perhaps the day I picked Sophie up from school and saw her enthusiastically explaining something to a group of children, smiling widely, waving her arms as if telling an incredibly exciting story. Or when Lily first said at dinner, Dad, Mrs. Johnson is the coolest mom in our school. She never screams and always talks to us like adults. And she also has delicious cupcakes. Alan raised his eyebrows and smiled reluctantly. Is this the one whose daughter is in Sophie's class? He clarified, pretending that he was just saying it. Yeah, Ellie. She's my friend, Sophie said, chewing pasta. And her mother, Sarah, is very kind. She always brings cookies to meetings and has the most beautiful smile. Is it true? Alan glanced sideways at his daughters, but that was the end of the conversation. Then he did not attach any importance to it. But then, he didn't notice Sarah Johnson right away. She and her daughter had only moved to the area a couple of months ago, and she and Ellie had not yet fully integrated into the school community. Alan had heard that Sarah was a single mother who moved here after a divorce, but he had never met her in person. He wasn't interested in other people's lives until his own began to crumble. The next meeting took place in the school parking lot. He was just finishing a phone call when he heard behind him. It seems like our girls are developing a friendship. He turned around. Sarah Johnson stood in front of him, holding her daughter Ellie's hand. Medium height, slender, with long dark hair tied in a messy ponytail, wearing jeans and a light sweater. Her eyes, brown with golden sparkles, looked straight at him, and a slight smile played on her lips. Eyes that seemed to see him as more than just the father of her daughter's classmate. Looks like it, he nodded, shaking her hand. Alan. Sarah. Nice to meet you. Her handshake was confident and warm. Ellie always talks about your Sophie, she continued, casting a quick glance at the girls, who were already happily chatting nearby. I think they found a common language. It seems so, Alan nodded. Lily mentioned you too. Sarah raised her eyebrows slightly. I hope in a good way. Only positive things, he confirmed with a slight smile. There was a short silence between them. Sarah bit her lip as if thinking about something, and then suddenly asked, Do you attend school meetings? Alan chuckled. Unless you're stuck at work. Although I'll be honest, I'm not the most active parent. Then you have a chance to improve. This Friday, there will be a charity fair at school. Ellie and I will be there. Maybe you'll take a look. She said this easily, without hinting at anything. Just a polite invitation. But for some reason, something stirred inside Alan. Maybe, he replied. Great, Sarah smiled warmly. Then maybe I'll see you. She turned to her daughter, took her hand, and walked towards the car. At dinner, Alan put down his fork and looked at Amy. She, as usual, sat with the phone in her hand, scrolling through messages and occasionally glancing at her plate. The children chatted among themselves, discussing school news, but Alan hardly listened. He already knew what her answer would be, but he decided to say it anyway. There will be a charity fair at school on Friday. he said in an even voice, setting aside his plate. Amy didn't respond immediately. She took a sip of wine, continuing to scroll through the feed, and only after a few seconds did she finally look up. What? What fair? At the girls' school, he repeated. Parents also participate. Sarah Johnson invited us. Lily and Sophie want one of us to be there. Amy frowned slightly, as if remembering what she was talking about. On Friday, she asked again. I have an important meeting with clients and then a corporate event. The whole evening is scheduled. I can't get out. Alan looked at her and barely noticeably clenched his fists. She didn't even try to pretend that she was sorry and didn't offer anything in return. For her, work has always been a priority. For her, these meetings with clients meant more than time spent with her family. Then I'll go myself, he said evenly, raising his cup of coffee. Yes, of course, Amy nodded, already looking at her phone again. Lily stopped chewing and looked carefully at her parents. Something flashed in her eyes. Misunderstanding? Disappointment? She turned to her mother. Mom, you haven't been going to school at all lately, she said quietly, even at parent-teacher meetings. Amy sighed irritably, as if she didn't want to discuss this again. Lily, I'm working. I don't have time to run around to meetings and charity events. That's what a father is for. Lily lowered her head. Sophie frowned but remained silent. Alan noticed how the girls looked at each other, and his stomach sank unpleasantly. He saw that they were used to their mother's attitude, but that didn't make the situation any easier. He put the cup on the table and quietly added, Don't worry, girls. I'll be there. Lily smiled faintly, but there was still disappointment in her eyes. Amy didn't seem to notice. She was already typing a message on her phone to someone again, completely immersed in her own affairs. Alan looked at her. His fingers curled around the edge of the table. On Friday after work, Alan picked up the girls and headed to school. The parking lot in front of the building was almost full. Parents, children, teachers, everyone was bustling around getting ready for the fair. Colorful garlands hung from the trees, lights on the tables twinkled in the gathering dusk, and the aroma of fresh baked goods, caramel and spiced apple cider hung in the air. Everything looked as if the school had turned into a cozy holiday corner for one evening. Lily and Sophie immediately ran up to the group of classmates, laughing and talking, and Alan slowly walked towards the central area, where there were already tents with food, toys, and crafts. His gaze slid along the rows of tables filled with homemade cakes, homemade candles, children's drawings, and crafts. There was a light, carefree atmosphere, one that reminded him of what a normal, happy life should be like. Alan, a familiar voice rang out. He turned around to see Sarah Johnson smiling at him, holding a tray of cupcakes. Glad to see you, he nodded, feeling how warm it was inside her from her sincere smile. You're on time, she laughed. I just need someone to help with these cupcakes while I sort out the tea. Alan took the tray and they walked towards the table together. Along the way, he noticed that on the neighboring tables children were selling lemonade. Someone was handing out caramel apples, and nearby there was loud laughter as a group of teenagers played ring toss. Near the stage, the school choir was rehearsing a performance, and in the corner of the yard the teachers were holding a quiz. Sarah worked quickly and deftly, handing out cupcakes, accepting money, and chatting cheerfully with parents and children. Alan was surprised at how easily she blended into this atmosphere. When the flow of customers subsided a little, she turned to him with a slight smile. How did you like the fair? I like it. The atmosphere is real, he admitted, looking around. Yes, I have always loved these evenings. They bring people together. Her gaze slid to his daughters, who were now excitedly choosing their own sweets, especially children. It's like you're the hostess of the ball here, he grinned, watching her wave welcomingly to one of her parents. Sarah laughed. Maybe, but I just love seeing everyone smile. For a moment, there was a light, warm pause between them. Then, from the other end of the yard, there was an enthusiastic roar. Someone had won the attraction and was now waving a huge, soft shark. Do you want to try your hand? Sarah asked with a mischievous sparkle in her eyes. What exactly? In shooting with a water pistol, She nodded towards the tent, where a line of children was already lined up. If you hit the target 3 times in a row, you win a prize. Alan chuckled, but when he saw Sarah's impatient look, he shrugged. Okay, why not? They approached the tent and Alan picked up the water pistol. Sarah, laughing, encouraged him, and when he hit the target twice in a row, she playfully pushed him in the side. Come on, don't let me down. The third shot was successful, and the seller gave him a prize, a small, fluffy owl. This is for you. He handed it to Sarah with a smile. She was a little confused, but then accepted the toy, squeezing it in her hands. Thank you, Alan. Over the next hour, he helped sell candy, chatted with other parents, and watched his daughters laugh and play, running around the playground without a care in the world. He felt calm, almost happy, as if for the first time in a long time everything was right. He even caught himself thinking that he hadn't thought about Amy all that evening. When the sun began to set, golden rays fell on people's faces, inflatable balloons swayed smoothly in the air, and music from a children's choir mixed with the cheerful hum of voices. Sarah moved closer, leaning slightly towards him. Thank you for coming. The girls are happy. Me too. He looked at her and nodded. I wouldn't miss it. Sarah met his gaze, a little longer than normal friendly communication required. There was something warm, subtle in her eyes, but Alan noticed it. He didn't analyze this moment, he just let it be. They were silent for several seconds until Lily's clear voice was heard. Dad, let's take part in the lottery. The main prize, there is a huge teddy bear. Then let's try, Alan smiled, feeling that this evening would be remembered for a long time. They headed towards the lottery table, and Sarah watched them go, smiling slightly. Alan and the girls returned home around 9 in the evening. Sophie, tired after a busy day, was already yawning, and Lily immediately went to her room to show off her prize from the fair to her friend. The house was quiet. It's too quiet. He glanced down the hallway. Amy's coat was missing. Her shoes were missing too. She still hasn't returned. Alan wasn't surprised. He knew that her corporate party could drag on, but in the depths of his soul something tightened unpleasantly. The girls didn't even seem to be waiting for her. They were used to it. Okay, princesses, it's time for bed, he said, helping Sophie take off her jacket. Tomorrow is a day off, but you should still get some sleep. Is Mom home already? Sophie yawned, hugging her father. No, but she'll come soon, he replied, patting her on the head. The girls went to their rooms, and 15 minutes later the house was silent. Alan sat down on the sofa, turned on the TV, but didn't even try to concentrate on the screen. He waited. Amy had no intention of staying at the office party for more than an hour. At least that's what she told herself as she left the office in a short black dress that showed off her figure. She knew that she would be back late today. She knew that she was lying to Alan, but this had long since stopped bothering her, especially when Dan leaned towards her ear and whispered, I have a room reserved. You don't mind extending the evening, do you? She didn't even try to come up with an excuse. A hot wave of desire swept through her body, causing her blood to run faster. They reached the hotel quickly, almost silently. In the elevator, Dan pulled her towards him. His hands slid over her hips, his lips hungrily on her neck. Amy was gasping with excitement, her pulse pounding in her temples. Damn, how she wanted this. At home, everything became boring and monotonous. And here, there was risk, adrenaline, passion. As soon as the door to the room slammed, Dan pressed her against the wall, his fingers digging into her hair, forcing her to tilt her head back. You've been waiting for this all evening, haven't you? His voice was hoarse and authoritative. Yes, she whispered, breathing heavily. I wanted you back in the office. Bitch, he grinned, pulling off her dress. You are mine, and you know it. He pushed her onto the bed, not giving her time to think. Her breathing became erratic, and her body was engulfed in flames. They tore each other's clothes, their kisses were greedy and rough. Dan grabbed her wrists, pinning her to the mattress. You're so damn beautiful when you moan, he grunted, thrusting into her harshly, making her arch and scream. Hell yes. Amy arched under him, digging her nails into his back. The room was filled with sounds of heavy breathing, groans, and bodies hitting the bed. She bit her lips to keep from screaming too loudly, but Dan liked it. He made her lose control, pressed, and dominated. "You are mine," he repeated again, looking into her eyes. "Understood?" "Yes. God, yes," she whispered, arching forward again. The hours flew by in a flash. When it was all over, Amy lay panting, her skin burning, her pulse pounding in her ears. Dan ran his fingers over her shoulder, watching her lazily. "Do you regret anything?" he asked as she began to collect the scattered clothes. She grinned as she fastened her shoes and glanced over her shoulder at him. Not for a second. She knew that her husband was waiting for her at home. But now she didn't care. Amy got into the taxi, leaned back, and closed her eyes. Her body was still throbbing from the experience. Damn, he knew how to treat a woman. A satisfied smile touched her lips. She ran her fingers along her neck, feeling a slight burning sensation from his kisses. There was a pleasant ache in my stomach, and my muscles still remembered his rough movements. She took her phone out of her purse and looked at the screen. No missed calls from Alan. Well, great, she thought, opening the front camera. Slightly smeared lipstick, slightly tangled hair. She took a napkin and carefully touched up her makeup. No trace of guilt. "Where are you going?" the driver asked, glancing at her in the mirror. "Home," she said in an even voice, giving the address. The taxi started moving. Amy looked out the window, watching the city lights at night. She knew that they were waiting for her at home. Alan girls. They probably returned from this damn fair, ate sweets, and laughed. She had to be there. Amy frowned slightly, but quickly pushed the thought away. She deserves pleasure. She worked too hard, sacrificed herself for too long for her family. Doesn't she have a right to something for herself? She looked at her phone screen and opened a message from Dan. "You were incredible. I want to do it again as soon as possible." Amy grinned and quickly typed out an answer. "I liked it. Give me a couple of days." The taxi arrived at the house. She looked at the dark windows. Is everyone already asleep? Great. Amy paid the driver, walked out, rocked a little on her heels, and headed for the door. Wine was still splashing in my head, memories of Dan's touch, his smell. She opened the door and quietly walked inside. "Did you have fun?" Alan's cold voice came from the darkness. Amy froze in place. He didn't sleep. He was waiting for her. Amy returned around 11. The door slammed louder than usual, and from the steps he immediately realized she was drunk. Alan did not move, continuing to look at the screen, but he felt her presence. "Are you still awake?" she asked, staggering in the hallway, having difficulty taking off her boots. "I was waiting for you," he answered calmly. She grinned, swaying. How caring. Her voice was slightly drawing, and in her eyes there was something between irritation and self-satisfaction. Alan slowly rose from the sofa and looked at her. The smell of alcohol, expensive perfume, lipstick slightly smeared on the lips. She looked pleased, too pleased. "Did you have fun?" he asked, keeping his voice level. Amy sighed, twirled her purse in her hands, and headed to the kitchen. "We had a great evening," she said over her shoulder. "You know how important it is to maintain relationships with colleagues." Alan slowly clenched his fists. He knew more than she thought. "Is it true?" he said, following behind. "And who did you support them with today?" Amy paused at the refrigerator, her fingers trembling slightly as she opened the door and took out a bottle of water. She took a couple of sips before answering. "With colleagues," she finally said, without turning around. "You know how it happens. Work, some wine, relax after a difficult week." Alan walked slowly around the kitchen, watching her. She didn't look him in the eyes. "Difficult week?" he asked, leaning on the back of the chair. "I wonder what was so difficult about it. Difficult negotiations, difficult menu choices at a corporate event, or difficult decisions." Amy slammed the refrigerator door shut and turned to him, crossing her arms over her chest. "What do you want to say, Alan?" Her voice sounded wary, there was a sharpness in it. He looked straight at her, studying her reaction. I want to say that I'm interested in how you spend your time. You are so busy all the time, and I don't even know what exactly. She rolled her eyes and brushed her hair back. Lord, is this happening again? Do you really want to make a scene now? After everything? After a good evening with the girls? Alan nodded slowly. Yes, good evening. Unlike yours. Amy glared angrily, but then sighed, rubbing her temple. Listen, I have no time for this. Let's discuss it tomorrow, okay? I'm tired. Alan leaned forward, resting his hands on the table. Of course, Amy, tomorrow. But remember, I see more than you think. Amy took another sip of water, trying not to look at her husband. There was a tension in the air that seemed like it could be cut with a knife. Alan didn't move, but his gaze literally pinned her in place. You're acting strange, she finally said, trying to maintain a confident tone. What kind of interrogation? Just trying to understand, he replied calmly. You said that you were with colleagues. Why didn't you answer calls then? Amy blinked, her shoulders tense. It was noisy. I didn't hear. Is it true? Alan cocked his head to the side. But at one point your phone was even turned off. She blinked quickly, then crossed her arms over her chest. The battery is dead. This happens, you know. Alan nodded, pursing his lips. Of course it happens. Who brought you home? Amy froze for just a split second, but that was enough for Alan. He saw her brain frantically searching for the right answer. Taxi, she said quickly. Interesting. Alan grinned. I thought you said that you went with your colleagues. Who exactly was in the car? Amy sighed, her patience running thin. Alan, are you serious? This is already stupid. I'm tired. I want to take a shower and go to bed. Stop making a scene. Alan nodded slowly, crossing his arms over his chest. Fine. Go take a shower. Clean yourself. But Amy. She had already turned around, but froze when she heard his voice. What? He paused, looking straight into her eyes. I see more than you think. Amy opened her mouth, but decided not to say anything. Instead, she turned around and went into the bedroom, leaving behind the smell of alcohol, expensive perfume, and fear. The next morning, Alan behaved as usual. No hint of irritation, no cold glances, no hidden reproaches. He greeted Amy at breakfast, made coffee, even asked how her meeting went. Ideal husband. Amy seemed to tense up a little, expecting something different, but quickly relaxed, deciding that all her fears were far-fetched. Alan smiled and was calm, and that suited her. Do you have any plans for the day? He asked, taking a sip of coffee. Work, as always, she answered, drawing out her words slightly. And you? I think we'll go to the park with the girls and get some fresh air, he explained calmly. Amy just nodded, turning her attention back to her phone. A couple of hours later, Alan and his daughters arrived at the park. Lily sat on a bench, burying her head in her phone, and Sophie bought herself a hot chocolate at a street cafe and began to slowly sip it. Alan, with his hands in his pockets, walked slowly along the path, enjoying the cool air. At that moment, he noticed a familiar figure. Sarah was walking with Ellie. Alan caught Sarah's eye, and she walked over first. Hello, she smiled. A good day for a walk. Yes, autumn still brings joy with the sun, he nodded. Sarah nodded, glancing briefly at him. Do you come here often? She asked, straightening her hair. Not as often as we would like, he replied. Usually everyone is busy with their own affairs. Oh, I see, Sarah chuckled. Sometimes it seems like days fly by without you even noticing. They were silent for a moment, watching the surrounding bustle. Sarah sat down on a nearby bench, watching Ellie enthusiastically tell Lily something. They were silent for several seconds, enjoying the peace. Sarah then turned to Alan and asked, Why are you alone today? Weekends are usually family time. Alan took a sip of coffee without immediately answering. He looked at his daughters, then exhaled slowly. Amy is busy, as always. Work, meetings, corporate events. This has become the norm in recent years. Sarah frowned slightly, her gaze sliding over Alan's face as if assessing his mood. You say that as if it doesn't surprise you. Has this started long ago? Alan grinned, but there was no joy in that grin. For a long time. At first I thought it was just a career stage ambition. But then I started noticing strange things. Late returns, coldness, a phone that she won't let go of. He ran his hand over his face as if trying to erase the fatigue. I don't want to jump to conclusions, but to be honest, I'm already almost sure. Sarah nodded silently, digesting what had been said. Have you told her about this? Not yet. But I'm watching. Alan's gaze became firm. If it turns out that my guesses are correct, I'm not going to turn a blind eye to it. Sarah looked at him carefully. You don't deserve to be treated like this, Alan. He smiled faintly. Thank you. But now I just want to get to the bottom of the truth. Sarah was silent for several seconds, looking into the distance. The autumn wind slightly ruffled her hair, and she automatically tucked a strand behind her ear. Then she said quietly, I know what it's like. Alan turned his head towards her, frowning slightly. You. She smiled sadly, wrapping her hands around the cup of cooling coffee as if trying to keep warm. Yes, my ex-husband. He was also good at hiding the truth. Late calls, business trips, sudden delays at work, and then an accidentally forgotten message on the phone screen, the too persistent aroma of someone else's perfume on his shirt. Sarah sighed, her fingers nervously squeezing the cardboard glass. At first, I didn't want to believe either. I justified it and looked for logical explanations. I thought that we were just growing apart, that everything could be fixed. But one day I came home and found him in bed with another girl. Alan listened attentively. Every fragment she told was reflected in his own story. He knew this pain. He understood her. How did you cope? He finally asked. It's difficult. Sarah shook her head, and a shadow of memory flashed across her face. There was a lot of anger, resentment, and sleepless nights. I asked myself, what is my fault? What did I do wrong? But then the realization came. If a person is capable of betrayal, then he is not the one with whom I should go through life. She shrugged and looked at Alan. At some point, I simply stopped fighting for what was doomed. Divorce was liberating. Yes, it was hard, but living in the shadow of constant lies is even worse. Alan nodded, understanding every word. He was where she once was. Only, unlike her, he had not yet crossed the line, had not yet taken the last step. And you? Sarah asked, watching him carefully. What will you do if your suspicions are confirmed? Alan curled his fingers around the paper cup of coffee. He knew the answer, knew it from the very beginning, but for the first time he said out loud, I won't forgive you, and I won't just leave it like that. His voice sounded firm, almost cold. If she betrayed me, then I will make sure she regrets it. Sarah looked at him carefully. There was no condemnation in her eyes, only understanding. She knew what it was like to burn in those flames. You're right, she finally said. But revenge is a very insidious thing. Sometimes it doesn't bring relief. Alan smiled bitterly. I'm not looking for relief. I'm looking for justice. There was silence between them for a moment. Sarah flexed her fingers hesitantly, then touched his arm lightly. You are a good person, and you don't deserve any of this. Alan looked up. Their eyes met. He felt something tremble inside him. Her touch was light, but it sent a current through my skin. Thank you, Sarah, he said quietly. She held her hand on his arm, a little longer than the simple gesture of support required, but then removed it, lowering her gaze. For the first time in a long time, he felt truly understood. Alan sat in the car, drumming his fingers on the steering wheel. His phone was in the front seat, and a new message from Bobby was on the screen. There's something for you. We'll see you in an hour. Old place. He picked up the phone, read the message again, and took a deep breath. This was the moment he had been waiting for. Now he will have proof. Now he can move on. But why was there not relief inside, but a cold, oppressive feeling? Maybe because it was not just a moment of truth, but a point of no return. The cafe where they usually met was quiet and uncrowded. Alan sat down at the farm table, ordered black coffee, and waited. He always arrived ahead of time. It gave him a sense of control. This is exactly what he needed today. Bobby didn't have to wait long. 5 minutes later, he sat down opposite him, placing a thick envelope and a flash drive in front of him. "It's all here," he said briefly, taking a sip from his cup. "I found what you wanted." Alan didn't touch the envelope. He just looked at his friend. "How bad?" Bobby pursed his lips. "Depends on your endurance. Let's just say she wasn't very careful. Hotels, restaurants, meetings in the car. Dan clearly does not hide the fact that she is his mistress. It looks like they decided a long time ago that you either wouldn't guess or wouldn't dare do anything." Alan clenched his fists, but quickly pulled himself together. He couldn't afford to act on emotions. Not now. He must think ahead. "Good job," he said calmly. "What's on the flash drive?" "Correspondence, calls, video from surveillance cameras. You asked for hard evidence, here it is." Bobby opened the envelope and took out a couple of printed photographs. The first shows Amy and Dan in a car, their faces close, too close for ordinary colleagues. The second, Amy leaves the hotel, a satisfied smile still playing on her lips. The third is their dinner in a restaurant, Dan's hand resting on her knee under the table. This, Bobby pointed his finger at the photo from the hotel, was recorded last night, just when you were at the fair with the girls. Alan's insides tightened. She betrayed him the moment he was with their children, when he tried to create something real for them. He silently put the photos back into the envelope and took the flash drive, feeling its weight in his fingers. It wasn't just a flash drive. This was the end of their marriage, the end of everything they built. "What will you do next?" Bobby looked at him, clearly expecting an answer. Alan thought for a second, then said firmly, "I'll ruin her life." On his way back home, he stopped at the park where he had recently met Sarah. The memory of her words resurfaced in my head. "You don't deserve this," she said. But did he deserve revenge? Without a doubt. He pulled the flash drive out of his pocket, spinning it in his fingers. Tomorrow he will begin his plan. But for now, he was just sitting in the car, listening to the steady patter of rain on the roof, and thinking about how much he was mistaken about the woman with whom he lived for so many years. The next day, Alan woke up earlier than usual. Amy was still asleep with her back turned to him. He lay looking at the ceiling, a clear plan running through his head. Now he had all the cards. All that was left was to play them correctly. No haste, no mistakes. He carefully got out of bed, took the phone, and went out into the living room. Opening his laptop, he inserted the flash drive containing the evidence. The screen blinked, revealing folders with photos, videos, and call recordings. He looked at images of his wife, the mother of his children, shamelessly betraying him with another man. Everything was seething inside, but he forced himself to remain cool. Anger should not take over. Alan created several copies of the files. He hid one flash drive in a safe in the garage. The second one was uploaded to cloud storage, setting up automatic sending by email if something suddenly happened to it. He wasn't going to give Amy any chance to destroy the evidence. Then he sat down to write the documents. Copies of the marriage contract, financial accounts, real estate, all this could be needed in court. He checked to see what conditions might give him an advantage in a child custody case. He wasn't going to let Amy drag the girls down with her into her deceitful world. He remembered the conversation with Bobby in the cafe. "She wasn't particularly careful." This phrase echoed in my head. How long had she thought he was an idiot? How long did you enjoy this humiliation? He went to the correspondence folder. The messages were bold, provocative, and dirty. She flirted with Dan in a way she hadn't done with him in a long time. "I want you right now. You're driving me crazy. When will we meet again?" Lines that might have hurt him before. Now he looked at them with absolute composure. He was ready. At breakfast, Amy noticed his unusual calm. She stole a glance at him over her cup of coffee. "You seem thoughtful," she said, buttering her toast. "I'm just thinking about the future." Alan looked up at her, in which there was no previous warmth. "In what sense?" There was a slight wariness in her voice. He smiled slightly. "In the most direct way. Looks like it's time to change something. Amy bit her lip, as if debating whether to dig deeper. But in the end, she just shrugged. Okay, I hope it's something good. Alan nodded, taking a sip of his coffee. Oh, it will be unforgettable, darling. Not for you. Later that day, he made an appointment with a lawyer. The meeting is scheduled for the next morning. He thought carefully about what questions to ask. How to ensure your victory in court as effectively as possible. How to keep your home, finances, and custody of your children. He didn't just get divorced. He erased her from his life. Meanwhile, Amy began to notice changes. Alan did not ask her when she would return, did not take an interest in her meetings, did not make the usual reproaches or sarcastic remarks. At first, this pleased her. Maybe he's finally cooled down. A thought flashed through her mind. But then a feeling of anxiety came. Alan looked at her differently. He became more silent. Sometimes she caught his gaze on her cold, studying, as if he saw right through her, as if he knew something. But what exactly? Amy wasn't sure. And Alan knew that this was just the beginning. The next day, Alan entered the law office exactly at the appointed time. A spacious office with expensive furniture, the smell of fresh coffee, the smooth voice of the secretary, everything said that he had come to a professional. A man of about 50 with a confident look sat at a massive table. He looked up from his papers and nodded. Alan, right? Have a seat. My name is Richard Cross. How can I help? Alan sat down, clasping his fingers. I need to prepare for a divorce, but in such a way as to emerge victorious. Richard smiled slightly, leaning back in his chair. Then let's start with the details. What do you have? Children, shared property, bills. 2 daughters, a house, joint savings, but most of it was earned by me. I have good reasons to demand custody. Alan's voice remained level. And there is evidence of his wife's infidelity. The lawyer raised his eyebrows. This changes a lot. If you have irrefutable evidence, the court will side with you, especially when it comes to custody. Alan nodded and took out the flash drive. Everything is here. Photos, videos, correspondence. She's been cheating on me with her boss for 2 years now. Richard took the flash drive, twirled it in his fingers, and shook his head thoughtfully. Is your goal only divorce, or do you want to punish her? Alan grinned, but there was no smile in his eyes. I want her to lose everything. Family, comfort, reputation. To understand what it means to be alone. Richard looked at him carefully, then nodded slowly. Then we will develop a strategy. The first step is to secure temporary custody. The second is to bring her dirty secrets to light at the right time. You will need to maintain your composure. Are you ready for this? Alan clenched his fists, then relaxed his fingers. He was ready. Let's begin. That evening, as Alan was picking Lily and Sophie up from school, his phone vibrated. Message from Sarah. Hello, this weekend is Ellie's birthday. We are having a small celebration at home. We will be glad to see you and the girls. What do you think? Alan thought about it. He hadn't planned any activities for the weekend, but the invitation seemed like a good excuse to spend more time in Sarah's company. Plus, the girls have become friends with Ellie, which means it will be a good opportunity to let them relax. Girls, how about Ellie's birthday this weekend? He asked as they settled into the car. Oh, cool. Lily immediately perked up. I was just thinking about what to give her. Yes, let's go, Sophie said. It will be better than sitting at home. Alan smiled, pleased with their reaction. He quickly typed a response to Sarah. Thank you for the invitation. We will. On the day of the party, Alan and the girls arrived at Sarah's house. The house looked cozy and decorated balloons, garlands, a table with treats. Sarah met them at the door, her brown eyes sparkling when she saw Alan. She looked relaxed and happy, wearing a simple but elegant blue dress that showed off her figure. I'm glad you came, she said, accepting a small gift bag from him. Well, it would be difficult to refuse, he chuckled. The girls wouldn't forgive me. Sarah laughed as she led them into the house. Several parents had already gathered in the living room. Soft music was playing, and children were happily running around the table with treats. Lily and Sophie immediately found Ellie, and a minute later they were already discussing something with her. "Come in, make yourself at home," Sarah said, touching his elbow. For some reason, this small gesture made his heart beat a little faster. Alan nodded and walked deeper into the room. He watched Sarah as she easily communicated with guests, carefully adjusted the garlands, and laughed with the children. She was completely different, warm, sincere, real. Not like Amy, who even at family gatherings pretended that it was all a burden to her. At some point, when the children ran off to play, they were left alone in the kitchen. Sarah opened a bottle of wine, poured them a glass, and looked at him. "You know, Alan, you look different. Calm down," as if he had finally made some important decision. He looked at her, his fingers barely touching her hand as he took the glass. The touch was fleeting, but there was something more in it. "Maybe it is," he said quietly. Sarah tilted her head slightly, studying his face. "You are a good person," she said after a short pause, "and you don't deserve everything you went through." Alan chuckled as he took a sip of his wine. "Sometimes I wonder, what if all this is not an accident? Maybe I had to go through all this too. Get here." Sarah didn't look away. "Maybe, or maybe you just deserve to be happy." When the last guests began to leave, the house gradually filled with pleasant silence. The children, tired from games and fun, sat in the living room, lazily texting on their phones. Lily and Sophie looked at each other, then Lily turned to her father. "Dad, can we stay overnight at Ellie's? We have already discussed everything with Sarah. She is not against it." Alan looked at Sarah, who nodded with a slight smile. "Of course, it's not difficult for me," she said. "There's enough space, but the girls are clearly not ready to say goodbye so quickly." Alan thought for a second. He knew that the girls felt comfortable with Ellie and her mother, which meant there was nothing to worry about. "Okay," he finally said, "just don't sit on your phones until late." "Thank you, Dad," Sophie exclaimed joyfully and rushed to hug him. Sarah led the girls into the room and then returned to the living room, rolling up her sleeves. "Well, one more glass," she suggested, showing a bottle of wine. Alan chuckled. "Why not? Since I was left here alone, I can allow myself to relax a little." They found themselves in the kitchen again. Wine poured into glasses, conversations became deeper, laughter sounded more and more often. At some point, Sarah reached for the bottle, but her fingers trembled slightly, and she spilled some wine on the table. They reached for napkins at the same time, their hands touching. She looked at him in her eyes. There was the same warm light that appeared before, but now there was something different in it, something more personal. "I think I went a little overboard," Sarah said quietly, leaning a little closer. "Perhaps," Alan smiled, but did not move away. A second of silence. Then she took a step forward. He reached out to her, and their lips met in a greedy kiss. Wine, warmth, electricity between them, everything mixed into one whole. Her lips were hot and soft. Her tongue boldly made its way inside, causing Alan to groan. He grabbed her waist, pulling her closer, feeling her body melt in his arms. Sarah gasped, her fingers gripping the collar of his shirt, and then, without hesitation, she undid the first buttons. Alan ran his hands along the curve of her back, feeling her breathing become ragged. She leaned against him, her breasts pressed against his chest, and he felt her nipples harden through the thin fabric of her dress. His palms slid down, covering her hips, and Sarah moaned quietly, arching towards her. "God." She breathed into his lips as he pressed her against the table, his fingers confidently sliding up her thigh, lifting the hem of her dress. Clothes fell to the floor one after another. Hot kisses left marks on the skin. His lips slid down her neck, collarbones, chest. Sarah arched, her nails leaving red streaks down his back. Their breath merged into one. Moans filled the silence of the room as they drowned in each other, surrendering to a primal, insatiable desire. The night belonged to them, and no one could stop them. Alan woke up to the soft morning light filtering through the curtains. He didn't move for a few seconds, just feeling the warmth nearby. Sarah. Her breathing was even and calm. She lay facing him, one hand casually resting on his chest. Her hair was slightly disheveled, her lips were swollen from long kisses. She looked incredibly beautiful, the real one, alive. He ran his hand over her shoulder, remembering the night before. God, it had been so long since he felt so. Right. No shame, no regrets, only peace. But with this came realization. His life is about to change. He has already taken a step, and there is no turning back. Sarah slowly opened her eyes and smiled softly when she saw him. "Good morning." Her voice was a little hoarse from sleep. "Good," he answered, continuing to study her face. She stretched slightly, her fingers sliding over his chest. "Don't you regret it?" she asked quietly. Alan shook his head. "Not for a second." Sarah exhaled in a relaxed manner and moved closer, pressing herself against him. Their lips met again in a lazy, slow kiss, but at that moment Alan's phone vibrated on the nightstand. He reached out and took it. Message from Amy. "Good morning. Are you home?" The girls wrote that they were spending the night at Sarah's. Damn, how symbolic. The wife who lied to him for 2 years now asks where he is. He chuckled to himself. Something important. Sarah noticed a change in his face. Alan looked at her, then back at the screen. "No," he said firmly. "Everything will change soon." Sarah nodded, and her fingers lightly squeezed his hand. And he already knew that he would not stop. The realization that the children could wake up at any moment set them in motion. Sarah was the first to jump out of bed, quickly pulling on her robe, while Alan found his shirt and jeans scattered on the floor. They exchanged quick glances and silently set to work to hide the traces of the night. Sarah quickly straightened the sheets while Alan cleaned himself up. A few minutes later, they looked as if nothing had happened, except that there was a sense of mystery in their glances. As soon as they left the bedroom, the first sounds were heard from Ellie's room. The girls were waking up. Sarah led Alan into the kitchen, where he took a sip of coffee before Lily and Sophie appeared in the doorway. "Dad, are we leaving?" Sophie asked, rubbing her eyes. "Yes, it's time," Alan replied softly. "Get ready." Sarah looked at him but didn't say anything. She only lightly squeezed his hand in a farewell gesture as he headed towards the exit. The road home was quiet. Alan knew that everything was just beginning. Alan returned home with his daughters, and the house greeted them with cold silence. He knew Amy had been out all night, but he pretended it didn't matter to him. The girls went to their rooms, and he poured himself some coffee and sat down at the kitchen table, going over the next step of his plan in his head. The door slammed a few hours later. Amy entered the house, throwing her bag at the entrance, and stretched as if after a hard night. She looked tired, but there was something else in her eyes' satisfaction. That relaxed sparkle in the eyes, slightly disheveled hair, satisfied half-smile. It was clear to Alan where she returned from. "Hello," she said casually, taking off her coat. "Are you home already?" "As you can see," Alan replied, without looking up from the phone. Amy walked to the refrigerator, pulled out a bottle of water, and took a few sips, then turned to him. "We had a lot of work yesterday," she began, crossing her arms over her chest. "I didn't have time to write to you, but I had to spend the night in the office. We were preparing a big project, and there was simply no time." Alan nodded, pretending to believe it. The lies flowed from her lips so naturally, as if she herself believed in them. "It happens," he said calmly. "I hope I at least got some sleep." "Just a little," she sighed and ran her hand through her hair. "By the way, I wanted to tell you. I need to go on a business trip for a week." He raised his eyes and looked at her. "Where to this time?" "In Miami," she answered quickly. "Business meeting with important clients. Nothing without me." "Miami, certainly." Alan nodded, pretending to believe it. But this time he didn't know she was lying. He had no information from Bobby, no intercepts of her trip. Only suspicions, but that was enough for him. "Do the girls know?" he asked, pretending to be slightly surprised by the news. "Not yet, but I'll tell them," Amy shrugged. "You can cope without me, right?" "Of course," he smiled. "Everything will be fine with us." Amy relaxed, deciding that he didn't suspect anything. She walked up to him and lightly touched his shoulder. "Thank you for your understanding," she said, then smiled. "I promise, as soon as I get back, we'll catch up." Alan forced himself to smile back, hiding his inner triumph. "I'm sure of it," he said. Amy turned around and headed into the bedroom. Alan watched as she disappeared through the door, and only then allowed himself to grin. "Oh, we'll definitely catch up, darling, just not in the way you imagine." Amy threw into her suitcase several summer dresses, swimsuits, and new sunglasses that she had ordered especially for this trip. Her heart was pounding with anticipation. A week in Bali, just her and Dan, without the need to hide, without regard to her husband and children, just the two of them. The phone vibrated, and she quickly grabbed it. Message from Dan. "Are you sure you got everything sorted out? I don't want any unpleasant surprises." Amy smiled and typed the answer. "Everything is under control. Alan didn't even suspect. He thinks I'm on a business trip." She glanced at the open bag. This vacation will be their special holiday. Their relationship deserves something big. Dan, of course, hasn't talked about the future yet, but perhaps this trip will push him to a decision. After all, he is also unhappy in his marriage, right? A couple of minutes later, another text came. "Great. We're leaving tomorrow at noon. Don't be late." Alan returned home later than usual, taking off his jacket and throwing his keys on the table by the entrance. The house was quiet. The girls had not yet arrived, and Amy, judging by the sounds of the water, was taking a shower. He walked into the bedroom, getting ready to change clothes, and then his gaze fell on the suitcase standing by the bed. He knew he shouldn't. Knew that this was a violation of boundaries. But damn it, she broke them first too. Alan leaned down, unzipped it, and carefully opened the lid. The first thing that caught my eye was thin lace underwear that he had never seen her wear before. A black translucent set that was clearly not intended for a business meeting. His fingers clenched into a fist. Nearby lay a bottle of expensive perfume, a small box with new jewelry, and 2 tickets. In Bali. For a second, he lost his breath. He took the tickets and glanced at the details. 2 places, 1 number. Alan closed his eyes, trying to hold back the wave of anger that washed over him. Here it is. Confirmation. The sound of the water died down. Amy turned off the shower. Quickly zipping up his suitcase, he took a step back, taking a deep breath. He already knew how to play this game. He won't make a scandal. No, that would be too easy. Amy felt a slight trembling in her fingers. She looked at the reflection in the mirror standing in front of her confident, beautiful woman who chooses her happiness. She closed the suitcase and sat on the bed, smiling. Tomorrow starts a new chapter in her life. Amy stood at the airport, looking out the window at the landing strip. The sun rose slowly, turning the sky pink and orange. Everything inside her was trembling with anticipation. This vacation meant more to her than just travel. This was her freedom. A familiar voice came from behind. "Well, are you ready for the best week of your life?" Dan approached her, putting his arm around her waist. His smile was self-confident. His eyes sparkled with excitement. Amy turned to him, ran her fingers along the lapel of his light jacket, and smiled. "More than that. I thought you'd be late." "I'm not a fool to miss something like this," he chuckled. "Have you settled everything at home?" "Of course," she nodded, trying not to show a drop of doubt in her voice. "Alan didn't even suspect it. He thinks I'm on a business trip." Dan chuckled, taking her suitcase. "So we have the whole week without worries." They boarded, and a couple of hours later, the plane took off from the ground, taking them to white beaches, gentle waves, and a week without restrictions. Alan sat in his car, holding the phone to his ear. He looked at the screen in front of him, at the photo of Amy's tickets that he found in her suitcase. She thought she had covered her tracks, but he was always one step ahead. The beeps continued for an excruciatingly long time before Bobby's sleepy voice came through the line. "Do you realize it's 4 in the morning?" The detective grumbled. "I need a favor," Alan replied calmly, ignoring his complaints. "A very important service." Bobby sighed. "Let me guess. Is this related to your wife?" Exactly. She is flying to Bali. I think I don't know anything. I need proof. Clear iron. So that in court she won't even have a chance to get out. You can arrange this, right? There was a short pause at the other end of the line. Do you seriously want me to fly to Bali for her? Bobby asked. This will cost you dearly. Money is not a problem, Alan snapped. I'll buy tickets for the flight. You will be there tomorrow. Just do your job. Photos, videos, conversations, texts if you can. I don't want her to have a chance to get away with it. Bobby chuckled. Damn it, Alan. You are determined. You can't even imagine how much, he answered coldly. Okay, the detective sighed. It will be done. Alan closed his phone, where he had just looked at a message from Bobby. The detective had already flown to Bali, and now all that was left was to wait. Amy didn't even suspect that on the other side of the world, her novel was already turning into her own death sentence. He took a deep breath and looked up. At that moment, Sarah opened the door of the cafe where they agreed to meet. The sight of her immediately changed his thoughts. Hello, she smiled warmly, sitting down opposite him. How are you? You look relaxed. Alan chuckled. Perhaps for the first time in a long time, I really feel like this. Sarah looked at him carefully, as if trying to understand what exactly had changed. She noticed a confidence in his eyes that wasn't there before. So you have made a decision? She asked carefully. Alan nodded, taking a sip of his coffee. Yes, and now everything is going according to plan. They were silent for several seconds. Sarah covered his hand with hers. You deserve to be happy, Alan, she said softly. And I'm just glad I could be there. He looked at her, feeling the warmth of her palm. She was another world, a world in which there were no lies. Alan stood at the door of Sarah's house, holding a bottle of red wine. He didn't remember the last time he felt real anticipation before a regular dinner. After everything that happened in his life, this feeling seemed like something new, almost forgotten. Sarah opened the door, a warm smile appearing on her lips. Come in, she said, stepping aside. I've already prepared almost everything. The house smelled of delicious food, warm comfort, and elusive relatives. He walked into the living room, put the wine on the table, and glanced at her. Sarah was in a simple dark blue dress that emphasized her figure. Her hair was casually tied up, with a few strands falling out, making her look even more lively. I hope you don't mind pasta, she asked, glancing briefly at him from the kitchen. You can't even imagine how hungry I am, he grinned, sitting down at the table. After a couple of minutes, she placed the plate in front of him, then poured the wine. They clinked glasses, and for a second there hung between them silent intimacy. I don't remember the last time I just sat and enjoyed the moment, Alan admitted, looking at her. Sarah smiled, but there was a shadow in her eyes. I understand. Life sometimes takes away such simple things from us, she said quietly. I, too, went through difficult times. Alan raised his eyebrows, waiting for him to continue. Sarah took a sip of wine and continued. When my ex-husband cheated on me, I convinced myself for a long time that it was just a temporary crisis, that he will correct himself, that this is a mistake. She lowered her gaze slightly. But do you know what is most painful? He didn't even try to really hide it. He was sure that I would endure. Alan felt his insides shrink. Her pain was so much like his own. How did you cope? He asked. Sarah looked at him and smiled softly. I stopped clinging to a person who doesn't care about me. She shook her head, and here I am, teaching my daughter how to be strong. I'm learning this myself, and it seems I'm learning to trust again. Alan looked at her, and at that moment he realized why he was drawn to her so much. They were both broken, but together, we could become whole again. He extended his hand, lightly touching her fingers. You deserve better, Sarah. She squeezed his hand in response. You too, Alan. It got dark outside, the evening continued, and between them there was something inevitably changed. Bobby was sitting at a small table in an outdoor cafe, hidden in the shade of palm trees. There was a tall glass of cocktail in front of him, But his gaze was not focused on the drink, but on two people sitting at a table a few meters away from him, Amy and Dan. They looked relaxed, sun, ocean breeze, light laughter. But Bobby immediately noticed that there was something not so. Dan wasn't as into Amy as she was into him. He was scrolling through his phone, distracted, and his smile seemed forced. Amy leaned closer, played with a glass of wine, touched his hand, but Dan responded with restraint. Bobby pretended to adjust his glasses and quietly snapped a few pictures with his phone. Crisp shots of Amy placing her hand over Dan's hand, their kiss, her shining face. He later followed them to the pool. Dan was telling something, gesticulating, but Amy suddenly frowned. "You still haven't said what you're going to do," Bobby heard. He leaned forward slightly to hear better. "What are you talking about?" Dan took a sip from the coconut without looking at her. "About us, Dan," Amy said irritably. "You promised that you would talk to your wife. You said that she doesn't mean anything to you anymore." Dan took a deep breath and looked at her. "Amy, now is not the best time." "You say that all the time," she hissed. "We are here, alone, in Bali. I want to know what I mean to you." Bobby chuckled. "Here are the first cracks." He took a few more pictures, while Dan seemed to be searching for words. "Of course, you are important to me," he finally answered. "But you have to understand that my divorce, it's not that simple." Amy quickly removed her hand. "So you didn't intend to leave her?" Her voice was cold. Dan remained silent, took another sip of coconut, and then calmly said, "Let's just enjoy our vacation, okay?" Bobby grinned and sent Alan his first message with photos attached. "The game begins. They're already bursting at the seams." Alan sat in his office, holding the phone in his hand. A new message from Bobby flashed on the screen. "The game begins. They're already bursting at the seams." Several photographs were attached to the message. Amy and Dan at a romantic dinner, their kisses, her shining gaze, and then a tense conversation by the pool, her irritated expression, gestures full of discontent. She wanted more, but Dan wasn't going to risk his marriage for her. Everything went even better than Alan expected. He leaned back in his chair, allowing himself a brief grin. Here she is, her ideal love. Rots from the inside. But he didn't have time to enjoy it. He opened his laptop and scrolled through a list of documents. Divorce application ready. Temporary child custody arrangements are almost complete. All that remains is the signature. Half an hour later, he was already in his lawyer's office. Richard Cross looked at the papers carefully, then looked up at Alan. "Are you sure you want to go this way?" he asked. "You could just show her the evidence and get her to sign the divorce amicably." Alan chuckled. "Amy deserves more than a divorce. She deserves to completely lose everything she tried to keep. Families, reputation, comfort." Richard nodded, stamping the document. "Then she will receive a notification starting tomorrow. A new game begins, Alan. Are you ready?" He took the pen and signed. "Ready." Alan left the office and took a deep breath. While Amy is enjoying the best holiday ever, her world has already begun to crumble. Amy sipped a cocktail while lying on a sun lounger by the pool. The warm sea breeze played with her hair. The sun pleasantly warmed her skin. She enjoyed every second of this vacation, not knowing that real hell would soon begin in her life. Dan was sitting nearby, but looked tense. He looked at his phone every now and then, quickly typed something, and did not react to her touch. She noticed this. "You're somehow not here today," she said, taking off her sunglasses and looking at him carefully. "Everything is fine?" "Yes, just something for work." He waved it off, pretending that everything was fine. Lie. She felt it a kilometer away. At that moment, one of the hotel employees walked past, talking loudly to a colleague. "They say the volcano may wake up. I hope we get lucky, and these are just rumors." Amy frowned. "What did he say?" she asked Dan. He shrugged, clearly not attaching any importance to this. "There is a volcano in the center of the island. Sometimes there is activity, but nothing reaches the coast. This is not a reason to panic." But she still felt a slight chill. Later that evening, over dinner, she tried talking to Dan about the future again. You said that we could be together. Her voice sounded insistent. Now that you're not at home, you can be honest. Are you going to get a divorce? Dan froze for a second, then took a sip of wine and slowly set the glass down on the table. Amy, let's just enjoy this ride, okay? She stared at him, feeling like everything was shrinking from anger and panic. So no, her voice trembled. Dan was silent. And at this moment, somewhere in the distance, there was a dull rumble shaking the air. Several people on the restaurant terrace turned their heads worriedly towards the horizon. Amy stood up abruptly from her chair, her heart pounding. What was that? Vulcan was waking up, just like her nightmare. Alan returned home late in the evening. The house was empty, only the weak light of a night lamp in the corridor illuminated the way. The perfect time to take action. He went into the bedroom and opened the wardrobe. His clothes took up exactly half the space, and the other half was filled with Amy's things. Soon there will be only orders here. No lies. Without betrayal. The first thing he did was take out his suitcase and start packing his things. Shirts, jeans, documents. All that mattered. There was no future for him in this house anymore. Then he sat down at the computer, opened a bank account, and transferred a large amount to a personal account that he opened a couple of weeks ago. Amy won't get a penny more than she deserves. The phone vibrated. Message from Bobby. I hope you're ready for this. I'm sending a video. Alan clicked on the link and the screen filled with movement. Amy, Dan, bedroom, their voices, their moans. He closed his eyes and took a deep breath. Now he had everything. Divorce, guardianship, new home, and revenge that will be sweet and merciless. Alan typed a short message to the lawyer. Make it official. Alan walked out of the courthouse, tightly clutching a folder of documents in his hand. The divorce was officially launched. Now all that was left was to wait for Amy to receive the notification. He got into the car and just sat there for a few minutes, staring into space. How many years had he lived a lie, pretending to be happy? Now it's over. He dialed Sarah's number. Is everything going according to plan? She asked as soon as she answered. Yes, all that remains is to transport the things. Are you ready for this? His voice was calm, but there was determination in it. Of course, she said. The girls will be only happy. When he arrived home, he was greeted by silence. An empty house that no longer had heat. He opened the closets in the children's rooms and began to collect things. Lily and Sophie stood in the doorway, watching him. So we're really leaving? Lily finally asked. Yes, he nodded. You don't belong here anymore. To all of us. Sophie came over and hugged him. Dad, I knew this would happen. We have been waiting for this for a long time. Alan felt his throat tighten. The girls understood more than he thought. A couple of hours later, the car was full of suitcases. He looked back at the house one last time. This house was a symbol of betrayal. Here he left his past life. Then he got behind the wheel and headed to his new home, the house where they were expected, a home where he could finally be happy. Amy stood in the airport lounge, her phone clutched in her sweaty palms. There is chaos everywhere. The queues for registration stretched for hundreds of meters. People were shouting, some were arguing with the staff. The red inscriptions on the board lit up one after another. Flight canceled, delay, airport closed. She glanced at Dan, who stood a little to the side, intently texting on his phone. He didn't even look worried. Dan, she called, coming closer. Did you find the tickets? He slowly raised his head and nodded. Yes, for the morning flight, he said calmly. Amy breathed a sigh of relief. Great. Then let's register and... I'm flying alone, Dan interrupted her, his voice cold. The world around her froze. What? I bought a ticket just for myself, he repeated, putting the phone in his pocket. Sorry, Amy, but I can't be stuck here. She felt how everything inside her tightened. He leaves her. Dan, you can't do this. I can't stay here alone. There was panic in her voice. He sighed heavily. Amy, I need to go home. I can't afford to take risks. You understand. He took a step back, avoiding her gaze. Good luck. Dan, she shouted, but he had already turned away and walked towards the boarding gate. He didn't even look back. She remained standing in the middle of the chaos, clenching her fists. The volcano was erupting. Dan left her, and now she was alone. The crowd around Amy thickened. The airport turned into chaos and despair. People tried to get to the reception desks, argued with the staff, some even cried. But the flights were canceled one after another. She checked her phone again. Dan didn't answer. Her heart was beating wildly. He left her. She's alone. Excuse me, when is the next flight? She asked the airport employee. She looked at her tiredly and shrugged. It all depends on the situation with the volcano. All flights are now canceled. We are ordered to redirect tourists to shelters. To the shelter? Amy asked, feeling the panic growing. I need to go home. Like everyone else, madam, the employee answered evenly and moved on, helping other passengers. House, she didn't know what was waiting for her there. But you can't stay here. She tried to find other tickets. There weren't any. Everything was sold out. A large drop of rain fell on her hand. She raised her head, the sky darkened, and thunder was heard. Damn, 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 she whispered, clasping her head in her hands. The loudspeaker announced, attention, all tourists must go to evacuation zones. Weather conditions are expected to worsen. The crowd moved towards the exit. Amy didn't know where to go. For the first time in her life, she didn't know what to do. With shaking hands, she opened her contacts and clicked on Alan's number. The beeps continued endlessly. Come on, answer, she whispered. And suddenly a short, all-clear signal. The subscriber is out of reach. She looked at the screen desperately, then dialed his number again, and again silence. It was as if he no longer existed. Her eyes stung, but she clenched her teeth, not allowing herself to cry. Had he turned his back on her too? She stood in the midst of panic, and she was overcome by an icy thought. Nobody needs her. Neither Dan, not Alan, not even to myself. Alan sat in his office, looking at his laptop screen. The divorce was officially launched. All necessary documentation has been completed and notification has been sent. Now Amy will no longer be able to get out. He sighed, closing his laptop. There's one last step left. When he returned to the living room, Lily and Sophie were sitting on the sofa. They looked at each other as if reading each other's thoughts. Lily spoke first. She didn't even call us Dad. Never. Alan sat down next to him, looking at his daughters. I know, he answered quietly. Sophie clutched the pillow in her hands, avoiding his gaze. She didn't even ask how we were doing, didn't write. All that matters to her is her business trips. There was disappointment in her voice. We were never a priority for her, Lily added. I didn't want to believe it before, but now everything is clear. Alan saw in their eyes pain, but not sadness, but awareness of the truth. They were disappointed in their mother, and they no longer wanted to cling to the illusion. He hugged them both tightly. Now we will start a new life. Together, no. He smiled. 4 of us. At that moment, there was a knock on the door. Sarah. She brought boxes of things, helping them set up their new home. Alan opened his phone and saw a new message from Bobby. She's trapped and alone. He looked at the happy faces of his daughters. Amy lost everything. The house was filled with laughter. Lily and Sophie sat in the living room, discussing how to decorate their new rooms, arguing about what posters to hang on the walls. Sarah was busy in the kitchen, laying out groceries, and Alan watched it all from the side, feeling something new, almost forgotten peace. He walked into the kitchen and leaned his elbows on the doorframe. Are you sure you're ready for this chaos? He asked with a smile, watching Sarah arrange the plates. She turned to him and laughed. Honestly, I like it. There is finally life in the house. Real, she said, tucking a stray strand of hair behind her ear. Alan nodded, feeling his heartbeat calmer, without tension, without anxiety. Previously, he had not noticed how much his old house weighed on him, the house in which he lived. Later in the evening, after the girls had gone to their rooms, Sarah approached him with a glass of wine. "For a new house?" she suggested, holding out a glass. Alan clinked glasses with her, looking into her brown eyes. "For a new house, and for a new life." For a second, there was silence between them, filled with something. More than just friendship. The phone vibrated in my pocket. Alan took it out and saw a new message from Bobby. "Amy is broken. Game over." He chuckled, put the phone on the table, and looked at Sarah. Amy walked out of the airport clutching her suitcase. The long, painful flight, the chaos of evacuation, everything is behind us. Now she is home, or at least she hoped that he was still hers. She hailed a taxi and gave the address. The driver looked at her in the rearview mirror, noticing her exhausted appearance, but said nothing. She didn't care. On the way, she opened the phone. Not a single message from Alan. None from girls. Just a business notification from the airline regarding a flight delay. Emptiness. Even Dan, who betrayed her, did not bother to leave a single line. She was nobody. When the car stopped at her house, Amy jumped out and immediately realized something is wrong. Alan's car was not in front of the house. The curtains on the windows have been removed. Nothing in the mailbox. My heart began to beat wildly. Everything looked different from when she left. The house seemed orphaned. She rushed to the door, inserted the key, turned it, and the door gave in easily. The house was empty. Amy froze on the threshold. No things, no photos, no traces of life. Only her own forgotten things that no one else needed. She was crossed out. She dropped her suitcase and ran through the rooms. Not a single child's toy. Not a single Lily book. No sign of Sophie. The bed in their room was made, as if in a hotel room that had not had guests for a long time. For a second, she felt dizzy. What's happening? Where are they? There was an envelope on the kitchen table. Her name. Next to him are the keys to the house. With trembling hands, she opened it and began to read. "Now, your home is now just empty walls, just like everything we had. You made your choice, and I made mine. Divorce papers are attached. I have custody of the children. They themselves wanted it. You didn't call them. You didn't write. Did you think they would wait? They chose me because I chose them, and you choose yourself. I'm not your husband anymore, and you are no longer their mother. Alan." The sheet of paper fell from her hands. She lost everything. Amy sat down on the floor right where she was standing, feeling her world crumble around her. She picked up the phone again and with trembling fingers tried to dial Alan's number. The subscriber is unavailable. She tried calling Lily. Silence. Then Sophie. The call was dropped. My heart was pounding in my chest. She was sure that she would fix everything, that she would return and convince Alan that it was a mistake, that he would forgive her. But he didn't even give her a chance. Tears welled up in my eyes, but I couldn't cry. She didn't feel anything anymore, only emptiness. Alan woke up earlier than usual, but this time not from anxiety, but from the soft light breaking through the curtains. For the first time in a long time, he felt at ease. He sat up on the bed, ran his hand over his face, and looked out the window. New home, new life. The aroma of freshly brewed coffee and the muffled voices of girls came from the kitchen. He went out into the corridor and heard them laughing. Laughter that had not been seen in the old house for a very long time. "No, that's wrong. It should be like this." Lily argued cheerfully with Sophie. "Dad, you'll say that I'm right?" "I don't even know what we're talking about yet," Alan smiled, entering the kitchen. The girls were sitting at the table. There were plates of pancakes in front of them. Sarah stood at the stove, holding a frying pan, her hair casually tied into a bun, and a slight smile on her face. She looked so natural. "Good morning," she said, looking at him a little longer than she should have. "Very kind," he replied, taking a cup of coffee. Alan sat at the table, watching the girls happily eat, chat, and plan their weekend. They didn't mention Amy even once. He turned his gaze to Sarah. She caught his eye and smiled slightly. Something turned upside down inside. For the first time in a long time, he wanted to live not for revenge, but for my own sake. Sarah, he said quietly as the girls left the kitchen. She turned to him, raising her eyebrows questioningly. Alan thought no more. He simply leaned over and kissed her. She didn't pull away. Alan was sitting in his office when the phone vibrated. Amy's number. He looked at the screen, then took a slow breath. It's time to close this gestalt. Yes, he answered calmly. There was a short pause on the other end of the line, then a familiar but trembling voice was heard. We need to talk. About what? His voice remained smooth, devoid of previous emotions. About us, about the children, about what's happening, she spoke quickly, as if she was afraid that he would drop the call. We don't have an us anymore, Amy, he said firmly. What do you need? I want to see the girls. Please, her voice broke. Alan closed his eyes. Did she remember them only now? They will decide for themselves whether they want to see you, he answered. I don't force them. But if you expect them to run to you with joy, don't get your hopes up. There was silence on the other end. Then a quiet sob. Alan, I ruined everything, didn't I? He exhaled, feeling only fatigue instead of anger. Yes, Amy, you ruined everything. She didn't object. I just squeezed out. Can I at least try to fix everything? Alan looked out the window. Sarah was busy in the garden. The girls were playing in the fresh air. His new life has already begun. Maybe, someday, he said, but not now. Amy cried, but he no longer felt pity. He was no longer part of her world. The courtroom was cool, filled with tense anticipation. Amy sat at the table with her back straight, but her face betrayed nervousness. This trial was her last chance. Alan sat opposite, absolutely calm. He knew that the decision was already a foregone conclusion. The judge looked at the documents, then looked up. According to the evidence presented, and also taking into account the interests of minor children, the court decides. Full custody of Lily and Sophie is transferred to the father, Alan Harrison. Amy winced. In addition, the defendant's claim for division of property was rejected. Due to the fact that the marriage contract provided for the protection of the plaintiff's assets, the court finds all financial claims unfounded. Amy bit her lip. Everything she had hoped for was crumbling right before her eyes. The judge continued. The court rules that, given the circumstances, the defendant can visit the children with prior agreement with their father. Amy grabbed the edge of the table. He controlled everything, even this. The meeting is over. The hammer hit the wood, and everything around seemed to freeze. That was the end. Alan stood up without looking at Amy. He won, and for the first time in a long time, I felt not revenge, but relief. After the court hearing, when the judge's gavel finally sealed the decision on full custody of Lily and Sophie, Alan left the courtroom with a feeling of victory, which was supposed to be his final victory over betrayal and betrayal. But walking along the corridor of the court, he suddenly felt a strange confusion, not only the bitterness of revenge, but also the severity of the loss that this decision brought. His gaze stopped at the reflection in the glass doors. He saw not just a winner, but a man tormented by pain and loneliness, who all these years had been trying to fill the void with other people's passions and revenge. In the first days after the trial, Alan was plunged into endless calculations, remodeling the house, legal minutiae, and rethinking all his plans. He continued to meet with Sarah, who became for him not so much a consolation, but a reminder of what a real, sincere union can be without lies, without masks, without the destructive game of revenge. In the evenings, when the children were already sleeping peacefully in their new cozy apartment, Alan sat on the porch with a cup of cold coffee and listened to the rustle of the autumn wind. He remembered everything, the years spent in the illusion of family happiness, the cold nights when hidden pain pierced his heart, and the moment when he finally realized that revenge would not return what was lost, but would only worsen the gap. He realized that the victory in court was only the last act of a dramatic performance, after which it was now time for real healing. Over time, Alan began to open up to his daughters. Together with Lily and Sophie, they sat down at the table. told each other about their dreams, laughed at old memories, and gradually learned to trust again. Sarah, with her quiet but unfailing support, became for them a real person who could be trusted not only with conversations about the future, but also with their pain of the past. One warm autumn evening, when the sun was already setting, Alan, sitting on the veranda of his new house with his daughters and Sarah, suddenly felt something resembling hope arise within him for the first time in a long time. He realized that his life should not be determined by the past, that he could choose not revenge, but love, not resentment, but forgiveness. He said quietly, "I chose to live for you for the sake of true joy, which does not require masks and lies. Let the past be left behind, and let us build the future together, with a pure heart and open hands." Lily asked with wide eyes, "Dad, does this mean you're not angry anymore?" He smiled. "You know, I realize that anger is not a force, but a burden that I want to get rid of. Revenge will not bring back what is lost, but love and sincerity can give us a new chance. Subscribe to our channel so that your love doesn't cheat on you, and go ahead and listen to the next story, because this story is nothing compared to the next one. If you're under 18, don't even think, click to the next one. 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 Click to the next one.